I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
I was shielded from the raw details.
It did change the village at the time.
As a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
On the morning of the 30th of October 1966, a discovery was made that was to plunge the village of Beenham into a nightmare that its inhabitants would have to live with for nearly half a century. The village of Beenham in Berkshire is only 51 miles from London, but in 1966, this rural community may as well have been a million miles away.
Back in the 60s, we all knew each other. It was more tight-knit than it is now. It's still a very close village, and everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
In the 1960s, Beenham would have been a quiet village. We never got called up to there for any problems at all.
Early in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of October in 1966, police received a call about a missing 17-year-old au pair called Yolande Waddington.
Yolande had only been working at the farm as an au pair for a matter of days before she went missing and was then reported missing by her employer.
At the same time, a discovery was made on land belonging to the farm where Yolande was a nanny.
Some clothing was found in a barn by one of the farm workers. He thought no more of it because previously other clothes had been found there. It was a location used by courting couples.
Unaware of the clothing, police spread the word about the missing 17-year-old.
The following day, further items of clothing were also found within the barn when farm workers went and moved some bales of hay. At that point, Yolande had been reported missing, so the fact that the clothing was found in the barn, reasonably close to where she was living, raised suspicions, and her employer was called to the scene.
It didn't take long before everyone's worst nightmares were realised.
On the 30th of October, a body was found by her employer in a ditch close by to the barn where her clothing was found. She was naked, or almost naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with twine, or baling twine. She had an item of clothing wrapped around her face and stuffed into her mouth. She had an injury to her rib cage just below her left breast, and she also had baling twine wrapped around her neck. And it was that what killed her.
1966 was a time before DNA and databases. All they had was good old-fashioned police work.
It was obvious from the outset that it was a murder, and it was treated as such.
Rodney Watson and Gary Deacon were local PCs at that time.
A telephone call came in to the effect that a body had been found in a ditch in a farm track at Beenham. It was quickly established that we had received a report of a missing girl called Yolande Waddington, and as a result, I, amongst others, went to the scene to secure the scene.
Murders weren't known in those days as such, so everybody was sort of rushing around trying to get things organised, and I had to go to sort of do the search that was going to be taking place at the scene. We were greeted with open fields, rural tracks, the barn down the road, and farm tracks, and basically all rural area. We were searching at the time with sort of what would be garden instruments, the rake, hose, garden forks, shears for cutting the grass.
The atmosphere at the scene was quite sombre. Obviously, it was realised that the body in the ditch was a female and matched the description of Yolande Waddington, and she'd obviously passed away.
You'd read about it in textbooks and everything, and you'd done it at a training school, but to be actually involved in a murder search was an experience.
I actually conveyed Yolande Waddington to the Royal Berkshire Hospital to the mortuary. I mean, I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
Identified by her employer, police were dispatched to give Yolande Waddington's family the horrific news. Giles, Yolande's younger brother, was 8 in 1966.
But I do recall this picture of opening the front door and finding a policeman in his full sort of uniform standing in front of me going, "I need to speak to your mum and dad." And that's the only real record I have. And then I have recollections of lots of people being in the house that were a bit unusual. And I would assume, in that case, there were various detectives.
This had been Yolande's first job away from the family home in Newbury, and despite only being in Beanham a few days, she was known as a friendly, talkative girl. News of the murder travelled through this country village fast.
I can remember the police presence. There were suddenly lots of policemen everywhere. When you came out of school or if you went to the village shop, there were policemen around, and it is quite memorable, something like that. It did change the village at the time then.
Berkshire was really a rural county, and apart from the normal problems that you had, maybe the occasional pub fights at the weekend, murders were unknown as such.
A call was made to London.
In 1966, it was standard practice for the Berkshire Constabulary to request the assistance of a Detective Chief Superintendent and a Detective Sergeant from the Metropolitan Police.
And it was felt that Metropolitan officers had the necessary experience and expertise in order to lead on these rare and serious offences.
With Scotland Yard on the scene, the investigation continued.
In the following days, a thorough search took place of the barn in the immediate area. Various items were seized. Sacks from within the barn, Yolande's clothing, a comb was found, a knife was found, which was believed to have been the knife that caused her injury.
The items were sent to the Metropolitan Police Lab in London for analysis, and then officers concentrated on piecing together Yolande's final movements.
Yolande Waddington was last seen on Friday the 28th of October 1966 in the Six Bells public house, Beanham. She got in there to buy a packet of cigarettes. She appears to have smoked one of the cigarettes within the bar and then left. That was the last time she was seen. It was always felt, I believe, that the offender would have lived in and around the Beanham area because of the isolated nature of where Yolande was found and the fact where she was last seen within the village centre. And therefore, investigators felt that the answer to who was responsible laid within the village. Everyone within the village was interviewed. The inquiry centred on who was within the Six Bells at the time she was, who left shortly after she did, and if they did leave, where did they go?
During their inquiries, officers began unearthing information that could prove crucial to capturing Yolande's killer.
The landlady of the Six Bells was interviewed. She remembers selling a packet of cigarettes to a girl fitting Yolande's description. A man by the name of David Burgess was in the pub at the same time Yolande was there. He'd been there the majority of the evening and left shortly after she did.
Just days after the brutal murder of teenager Yolande Waddington, police already had a suspect. In 1966, the rural village of Beanham in Berkshire was left reeling when the body of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington was found naked and strangled in a farm ditch. Local police had been bolstered by the arrival of the Met Scotland Yard. Items belonging to Yolande found at the scene had immediately been sent for analysis, and after a few days, they already had a suspect, a local man called David Burgess.
He was of interest because he was in the pub, the Six Bells, at the time Yolande was there and left shortly after she did. The following day, he was seen with scratches on his face. He stated that he'd fallen into a bush on his way home. Police spoke to him. He stated he had been in the Six Bells and then had walked home from the Six Bells.
With nothing else to go on, 19-year-old local lad David Burgess was released and the investigation moved on.
Everyone within the village was interviewed to establish where they were on the Friday that Yolande went missing.
Over the next few weeks, the usually quiet village of Beenham was a hive of police activity as they hunted Yolande's murderer.
I can remember the parents being really quite concerned of us kids going out to play, and the people in the village were quite scared.
At the time, our school was just down at the end of the lane there, and we used to just run up the lane and round and home. But once this happened, then all the mums were always at the school to meet us and walk us home. The police presence outside the hall, they were always there every day, which was obviously quite strange for Beenham to have so many police around.
There's always ripples to any murder, but in a very small community, I think that those ripples are felt very, very keenly. Immediately, you start to look at your neighbour and feel suspicious, and immediately there's a fear of people who are close to you and known to you. This is not the kind of thing that happens to us. It's the kind of thing that we read about in newspapers or we watch in plots on TV or in Hollywood films.
After almost 2 weeks of inquiries, where over 1,000 statements were taken, Yolande's clothing and effects had been analysed. The results were to send the investigation in a direction that would end up making history.
During the investigation at the barn, her jumper was found. On that jumper was blood. When that blood was examined, it was found not to be hers. Following that, it was decided to request blood from every person, every male, over the age of 16 that lived in and around Beenham.
This was a bold move by police, as the science behind it was in its infancy.
Limitations of forensic science testing in the 1960s basically revolved around the limitations of testing for blood. We knew that there were 4 blood groups, and you could break it down a little bit more, but you could never rule somebody conclusively in as a suspect. You could only rule them conclusively out.
Progress, though, had recently been made.
In 1966, 2 forensic serologists working for the Metropolitan Police came up with what they thought would be a new technique that could be used for forensic applications. The new application would help to further distinguish individuals on the basis of their blood.
By early November 1966, police decided to push on with what became the first mass blood screening ever attempted in the UK.
Posters were put around the village inviting men over 16 to give blood and also showing a knife similar to the one found in the barn. Following the publication of those photos, David Burgess approached an officer within the village and told him that he wants to own a knife very similar to that.
Yolande's murder would have been very big news in a very small village. So here is a concerned citizen who is giving police information about a knife that they've recently lost. That's very helpful, but it becomes slightly more suspicious when you also factor into account that Burgess was also the last person to see Yolande alive.
Before a single blood sample had been taken, David Burgess had re-emerged as the police's main suspect.
David Burgess was arrested in interview. He stuck to his story. The fact that he was in the pub, he couldn't dispute that because other customers had seen him. And the scratches, he explained those by saying he'd fallen into a bush on his way home because he'd had too much to drink.
Despite letting him go again, David Burgess, who worked at the local gravel pits and was already known to the police as a troublemaker, soon became the subject of gossip amongst the local bobbies.
I was kept abreast of things through snippets of colleagues who were undertaking the parts of the inquiry teams, and and it became obvious that David Burgess was the chief suspect, although it was proving difficult to back up his claims with actually corroborative evidence.
Frustrated they couldn't prove Burgess's guilt, police continued looking into other local men.
My dad actually got arrested for the murder for Orlandi, because what happened was the bus stop used to be outside the Six Bells pub, and he was in the pub and he had a Land Rover, and he said to her, because he was tipping down around, sit in my Land Rover while you wait for the bus. And somebody must have clocked that, and he got arrested and taken in, but in the next day was released, so they know he never done it.
There are 16 men that were of particular interest to the investigation. However, one by one, those men were eliminated.
With the investigation floundering, police still had what they hoped would be the ace up their sleeve. On November the 23rd, 1966, blood samples were taken from every male between the ages of 16 and 50 living in Beenham.
In excess of 200 men had their blood taken. The type of blood grouping that was done was new.
This case was certainly one of the first times that mass blood screening was used. The most well-known instance happened in the 1980s, but this predates it by at least 20 years.
Police were hoping that identifying whose blood was on Yolandi's jumper would lead them to her killer.
They were able to say that only 2% of the population would have had blood of that type, and that was borne out by the fact that out of in excess of 200 men that gave their blood, only 4 people had the same blood grouping as that found on Yolandi's jumper.
Police were desperately hoping David Burgess was one of them.
It wasn't his blood on the jumper, or his blood didn't appear to match the grouping that was found on Yolandi's jumper, so there wasn't a great deal more that the police could do. With the 4 men whose blood matched the grouping of the blood found on Yolandi's jumper, they were all subject of intense investigation. All of them had alibis for what they were doing, and therefore were ruled out of the investigation.
It had been a massive gamble to take this unprecedented step in the investigation. Unfortunately, it hadn't paid off, and the police were back to square one.
The investigation were obviously limited as to what they could do forensically. They did all they could in relation to try and show who was at the scene with Yolandi, but back in 1966, they couldn't progress it.
With no new evidence coming to light, there was a difficult decision to make.
The investigation finished in March 1967. The officers had done all they could to try and establish who was responsible for Yolandi's death, but unfortunately, after almost 6 months, they had no evidence that could be used to charge someone with her death.
I imagine that the killer would be feeling that they'd gotten away with it, they'd been successful, and they'd be feeling quite a thrill from that. They'd be feeling empowered and invincible.
The investigation was never officially closed, and suspicions remained about David Burgess. But for now, the evidence from the scene was stored for future analysis. Despite all the police's efforts, the murder of Yolandi Waddington remained unsolved. After 6 months, the investigation into the murder of 17-year-old au pair Yolandi Waddington had been stopped. The village of Beenham looked as if it was going to be living with a killer on the loose for the foreseeable future. Inquiries may have ended, but despite there not being a match in the UK's first mass blood screening, local troublemaker David Burgess remained the police's prime suspect. This was a village on the edge. On the 17th of April 1967, the village of Beenham hit the news again.
We've got another call come in to say that 2 9-year-old girls hadn't returned home after going out to play in the village of Beenham. And we all thought, no, this cannot be. Surely nothing's happened to them. But I attended with a lot of officers, probably 20 to 30, and volunteers from the village, and we searched the area by some gravel pits, and having been issued with the whistles to blow if anything was found, after about half an hour or so, somebody blew a whistle.
The whistle could mean only one thing.
When the call came in to say 2 bodies had been found, then you get a bit disheartened, you think, how sad. And it was a lonely area, these 2 young children as they were out there on their own, and something had happened. Devastating, really, yes.
The awful news reverberated around the village.
We were really in shock, and the teachers were in shock, parents were in shock, and it was really quite scary, actually.
Police quickly got to work. They were determined that this murder would not go unsolved.
It was obvious that these 2 girls had been murdered, so an investigation took place.
It wasn't long before police had a person of interest, and the name didn't come as much of a surprise.
Because David Burgess was one of the main suspects in the Yolandes case, the fact that he worked so close to where the bodies of the 2 9-year-olds were found made him a strong suspect almost from the outset. He was interviewed, his clothing was seized, and from one of his boots some blood was found, and that blood grouping matched one of the girls.
David Burgess was charged with the monstrous killing of the 2 9-year-old girls, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams.
We'd heard that Burgess had been arrested on the possibility of committing the murders of the 2 schoolgirls, and I suppose we were all really delighted.
In July of 1967, just 4 months after the horrific killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline, David Burgess was presented at Reading Crown Court accused of their murder. It was a swift, uncomplicated hearing.
Burgess stood trial and was convicted of both the murders of both 9-year-olds in July 1967.
Escorted to his life sentence by Rodney Watson, Burgess's behaviour was, under the circumstances, bizarre.
And I was handcuffed to him in the dock, but most of the time he didn't really seem worried about what was happening. He kept on looking round, occasionally laughing, chuckling to himself, and not really worried about proceedings. And a very strange person I found to be in that position. I would have been worried myself. And then he was remanded in custody and then taken down and then released into the prison authorities. And that was the last time I ever saw him, in fact.
Now, I know that when I assess psychopaths, some of the things that I look for are callousness, lack of empathy, but just a general blunting of emotional response and effect. Now, here is somebody who is acting very oddly indeed. We know that he's not got a mental illness, but you have to question what else is going on.
Rodney's macabre introduction to the darker side of police work was over. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had murdered Yolande Waddington? In 1968, a potential answer came from prison.
David Burgess admitted to being responsible for causing Yolande's death to a prison officer, and that prison officer subsequently made a statement to police.
Could the man who police had always suspected of Yolande's depraved murder be confessing?
On April 3rd, 1968, Burgess was interviewed in prison by police officers in relation to the admissions he'd made concerning Yolande's death. To those officers, he said words to the effect of, "You'll have to prove it."
The fact that somebody was prepared to indulge in this sort of conversation and admissions and them saying you prove it as if it was some sort of game, totally disrespectful to the girl and the family and the family of the 2 other girls.
In talking about Yolande's murder and taking responsibility for that murder, Burgess is meeting 2 needs. First of all, he's letting people know how clever he is because he's got away with murder. But also, crucially, is re-engaging with that murder and re-engaging with the emotions that that murder brought about in him. So he's feeling powerful, he's feeling a thrill. And let's face it, when you're incarcerated, there are very few other outlets for that type of thing. If you can't commit a murder, you talk about a murder.
Police decided to test Burgess's blood one more time.
Following his admissions, the jumper was tested yet again in relation to the blood found, and a report was submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions. However, the blood grouping still didn't match that of Burgess, and as a result of that, the Director of Public Prosecutions stated that he didn't believe it was worthwhile pursuing the charge against Burgess.
It was a bitter blow, and it was looking like Yolandi's murder was never going to be solved. In 1996, 48-year-old convicted double child murderer David Burgess absconded from open prison.
At one point, Burgess was on the run for in the region of 18 months and took over the identity of someone that he knew that had died. He was subsequently arrested when he committed an armed robbery. We don't know where he was throughout the 18 months.
Sexual offending by its nature is addictive, and here is an individual who would be at very high risk of reoffending. But that's not to say that other murders would be inevitable, although they are possible.
When I heard that he'd escaped from an open prison, my thoughts were, how could somebody who's killed two 9-year-old girls be deemed safe to allow out into the public?
By February 1998, David Burgess was back in prison, whilst Beanham tried to get back to normal. But the village always had a cloud hanging over it.
There's a very good history of Beanham, which was written by the local history group some 10 years ago, but it doesn't mention the murders.
It was a subject that was almost taboo.
I would say I would very rarely hear anyone talking about it here in the pub.
As many tried to forget, Giles, Yolandi's younger brother, was just finding out the full horror of what had happened to his sister.
I discovered a pile of press cuttings hidden away out of view. Obviously being put away so that I didn't find them, but I did, and there was a sort of Yolandi's photograph plastered on the front page, and there were sort of police and other sort of articles. So I found out a little bit to know that my sister had been murdered.
With David Burgess safely back behind bars, advances were being made in DNA analysis, meaning previously unsolved murders were worth revisiting.
In 1985, research published at the University of Leicester proved that new DNA analysis techniques could be used to link specific individuals to offences, and has since been used in many different capacities to solve homicides and sexual assault cases.
This breakthrough led to cold case units being set up by police forces around the country.
I retired in 2007 and then came back in my current role as a member of police staff, reinvestigating historic cases.
Eventually, in September 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team turned their attention to the unsolved murder of Yolandi Waddington.
So with Yolandi's case, we initially looked at what the case was about, looked at what case papers we had, and importantly what exhibits we had, and did an audit of those exhibits to see what was still in existence, and then did an assessment as to what potential there was to use new forensic techniques on those exhibits.
Could advances in forensic sciences finally help police find Yolandi's killer 44 years after her murder? Up until 2010, the 1966 murder of Yolandi Waddington remained unsolved, despite the police believing that double child murderer David Burgess had been responsible from the very beginning. Then Thames Valley Police decided to reopen Yolandi's case to see if DNA could identify and convict her killer. The new investigation began by finding out what evidence had survived.
We had items that were found in the barn, some items of her clothing, but importantly, what was missing was the oatmeal jumper that Yolande was wearing at the time of her death. That was an item from which a bloodstain was found, which wasn't hers, and it was that bloodstain, the grouping from that bloodstain, which was used on the initial investigation to get the blood grouping with which to match against people from within the village.
As the only item belonging to Yolande with someone else's blood on it, the missing jumper was a big blow.
There were another key items that still did exist, and it was those that we were able to submit to the forensic laboratories for further work to take place.
By January 2011, police managed to recover Yolande's headband and a plastic fertiliser bag. Now it was up to the lab to find DNA not belonging to Yolande.
We here at LGC have a cold case team that is dedicated just to cold cases. We'll use whatever available technology is there in order to try and help solve the case.
Locating the evidence was only half the battle. Usable DNA needed to be found.
One of the most important items was the polythene fertiliser bag that was found at the scene of the crime. Because the original note suggested there was blood on there, and obviously they'd got blood grouping results from that item. So we went back to it, and sure enough, there were still crusty blood stains on that item. We then sampled some of those stains and carried out DNA profiling on them and got a good profile.
The lab was quick to give Thames Valley Police the news.
And they said that they had a profile. That profile, a DNA profile that is, that profile was then searched against the National DNA Database, and there was a match against David Burgess.
Already in prison for double murder, David Burgess was in the frame again. But it did pose the question, why hadn't he been a match when he was tested in 1966 or 68?
I would have expected him to match if the test had been carried out correctly. And unfortunately, we can't go back and recheck that particular test, and we don't have any documentation in order to see whether there might have been a transcription error, a problem in moving information of the actual type onto another page that was used in a report, for example.
As far as the team were concerned, Burgess's blood had been incorrectly categorised in the 60s. But persuading a jury of this wouldn't be easy. They had to use the DNA to prove that the blood had always belonged to Burgess.
Although it was good evidence to have Burgess's DNA on that sack, the problem we had was that he was a local young man, would have had ready access to that barn, so we had to get evidence over and above that, because potentially he could have just said, yes, that's my DNA, I'm local, so what?
Roy Green and his team at LGC continued investigating the evidence.
As we looked through the old case notes that were prepared over 40 years previously, we noticed that one of them, the headband, had a description of it saying grubby, and that was it. But on examining the item, we found that what were thought to be grubby marks were actually blood. The DNA profiling results showed that there was a mixture of DNA on the headband. Some of it could have come from Yolande, and that's to be expected because it was her item. But also, some of it could have come from David Burgess.
If Burgess's DNA was definitely on the headband, it would show that he'd come into direct contact with Yolande. Police had to prove beyond any doubt that the DNA was his.
We had to refer to a specialist in genetic statistics at UCL, and he was able to say that, in his opinion, the DNA profile found on her headband was a 1 in a billion match probability to Burgess.
A 1 billion to 1 match was conclusive proof that Burgess and Yolande had had physical contact. It was time to let the surviving members of Yolande's family know what was happening.
I tend to try and only make contact with the family when we have new evidence, which hopefully will bring their case to a successful conclusion. In Yolande's case, I approached Giles, her brother.
There wasn't a sort of sense of relief, a sense of... I can't say that I felt anything. It's a process, and it still feels as though it's a process, because it makes no difference to the end result. Yolande is dead, never to be alive again. The bit that I was worried about was the impact it would have on my dad in his twilight days.
For the police, turning failed investigations around wasn't just about pride.
Each one of our undetected cases has obviously a victim and the victim's family. The impact on families is massive, in as much that it's difficult to comprehend what that family's gone through. And when we visit them sort of 10, 20, 30 years after the event, you can still see the impact, in as much that there's a picture of their loved one, either on the television, on the mantelpiece, and it never goes away. It's something that they think about every day.
My parents were certainly not wanting a repeat. Well, their trust in anybody disappeared, evaporated completely, for the simple reason that their precious daughter had been taken from them.
Pete Byrne and his team had to put together a case to back up the DNA.
It's really, really pleasing to get the forensic result, but that's just the start of it, really. From that moment on, we then have to look at the case and build the case up against Burgess.
Police had to painstakingly trawl through all the evidence from 1966 and find the original witnesses.
They were all seen, if they were still alive, interviewed, asked in relation to their initial statement, whether they wanted to add, alter or correct anything in relation to what they'd said back in '66 to what they could remember in 2011.
In November 2011, the prime suspect in 17-year-old Nanny Yolande Waddington's murder was interviewed about some of the original evidence from 1966 that had implicated him.
Did you get those scratches because Yolande scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that, and you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said. We're saying the knife that you lost is identical. You say you lost. Is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolande Waddington. That's a coincidence, then, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife that was used. How many people in Venham had a knife similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, are they?
Finally, Burgess was asked about his confession to prison guards.
And you thought it was safe to say that here?
No.
It was safe, wasn't it?
I'd never say something like that if I committed a murder. I wouldn't go around shouting about it.
After we finished interviewing Burgess and he was charged, we then carried on building the case up against him, putting the file in to the CPS, and then getting ready for the trial.
45 years after he'd first been the main suspect in Yolande Waddington's brutal killing, David Burgess was going to stand trial for her murder.
It's not every day that you get told that your sister's murderer has just been arrested. It was a sort of sense of, wow, that's progress, and significant progress.
On the 18th of June 2012, David Burgess stood trial at Reading Crown Court.
I was confident in the results that we'd obtained, but in the background there was always this mistyping of the original blood grouping results that could be a potential stumbling block.
If the defence could sway the court into believing there was no way that the two blood tests done on Burgess in the 60s could have been wrong, he'd get off the murder of Yolande yet again. It was a difficult time for Giles.
There is no provision whatsoever for, or any preparation that can prepare anybody for facing a trial as a victim's relative.
For David Burgess, it all seemed nothing more than an inconvenience.
I saw him throughout the trial. His attitude didn't seem to have changed at all from when we'd first interviewed him. He just simply appeared bored by the whole proceedings.
The jury and Giles were told all the grisly details.
The fact that she'd been found naked, her clothes had been strewn about, she'd been stabbed, she'd been strangled, the whole thing had been a sexual crime. And that's the bit that was uncomfortable, because I found it out for the first time.
Through expert witnesses, the prosecution explained how the original blood tests must have been wrong, and more witnesses called.
One of the key points of the trial was a witness that we'd located in Australia, who was living in Beanham just prior to the murder. She gave evidence to the effect that Burgess had attacked her one evening prior to the attack on Yolande. We were able to use that evidence, what's called bad character evidence, put that before the jury to show the type of man Burgess was.
Once all the witnesses found by Pete Byrne and his team had given evidence, there was only the DNA left.
We're fortunate that the scientist was able to explain to the jury in layman's terms what that DNA consisted of and how he was confident that the DNA that was found on the items belonged to Burgess.
In the end, everything relied upon the jury understanding the complex evidence.
The trial lasted 5 weeks in total. The jury were out for 5 days, after which they came back with an 11-1 majority verdict that Burgess was the killer.
On the 23rd of July 2012, almost half a century after Yolande Waddington's murder, David Burgess was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. It was a huge relief to Giles.
For want of the better expression, shouted from the rooftops to say, no matter how old the crime, the resources are now there to provide justice now.
He should be 92 years of age when he's released. I don't think he should ever be released.
Burgess is clearly a sexually motivated repeat killer, and you do wonder how his killing career would have been progressing had he not been caught. But as a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
We're very, very pleased that we got the result, but that's what me and my team do. We reinvestigate the historic cases that are unresolved.
Burgess was sent back to prison, but questions were raised about the 18 months he'd been on the run.
We made sure that forces were also made aware of the fact that there was a convicted killer that potentially could have committed offences anywhere within the UK within that time, so we passed on his details to other forces.
By the time Burgess is eligible for parole, he will have spent 73 years behind bars for the 3 murders the police know he's committed. The question is, are there more?
Join the team and face the day-to-day struggle of stamping out crime. Leave it to the experts, Saturday at 10 in the Force North East.
Please, how can I help? I need to report a missing person. She's only 16. She's not come home.
She'd never gone missing before. She's just staying at her friends, you know, she's hiding.
Maybe she's drunk a bit too much and she's sleeping it off.
My Facebook blew up with her face, basically. It was everywhere.
I just remember wondering what's happened and what's gone on.
You know, the gut feeling was getting stronger and stronger that something serious had happened.
This is something you see on the TV, this is something you read in papers.
There was a huge search operation going on over many days involving dogs, air support and boots on the ground.
And I knew then that that was my Louise. I knew she'd gone.
In the Hampshire town of Havant sits the close-knit community of Lee Park.
It's a nice, quiet area. It's nice living here, friendly. My neighbours are really nice, you know. It's a very, very cosy area to live in.
I've lived here 47 years now. People's all lovely. I enjoyed the place, I really do.
It's safe, and that's what made us move here, was the fact that it was safe and secure. There was very little crime.
When things happen, the community does pull together and help the people out. So I think in a whole, Lee Park is a good place to live.
Lee Park is also the home to popular 16-year-old Louise Smith.
As a baby, like as a newborn, she was really just quite a quiet baby, to be honest. She used to sleep through the night regularly.
She was just a really good little girl. Bradley, my brother, used to come and stay with me with her. And she'd just come in and say, "Can I play with your shoes, Auntie Hayley?" She'd go in my shoe cupboard, get all my shoes, and she'd clonk up and down the kitchen and in the hall, and she loved it. She loved dressing up, you know. She was just like, oh, she was just a lovely little girl, really good girl.
And as she grew up and she began to toddle around, you know, she started to show a cheeky sense of humour. You know, sometimes I'd look at her and she'd just have a certain look in her eye, and I just knew she was going to come out with something. I just knew straight away. You know, and she was quite a bright and happy child.
As a young teenager, Louise enjoyed holidays and days out with her aunts and nan, and loved going to theme parks with family friend Sharon.
Louise, honestly, she had adrenaline rush on the roller coasters, especially on the Smiler at Alton Towers. She'd come to Legoland, she'd come to Chesington. She loved Chesington, especially like the tigers and that. Louise was like my own daughter. We just really enjoyed each other's company.
Louise's parents split, and her father Bradley later moved to Scotland, but maintained a close relationship.
I used to have her every fortnight for a weekend. School holidays, half terms, I'd have her for a week. And one summer holiday, she stayed with me for 5 weeks. You know, because she just wanted to stay with me. And so, you know, whenever I could. She came up to visit, we went to Edinburgh, because she always wanted to see Greyfriars Bobby and touch his nose, the statue for luck. By chance, when she came up, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival was on, and we walked around and saw it, and she loved it. I could have as much contact with her as I wanted. I was always allowed a good relationship with her, you know, without any problems.
After school, Louise moved to a local college and studied veterinary care.
She loved animals. There was no doubt about that. She absolutely loved animals. Like I said, we went to Chesington, and out of everything, it was the animal shows she wanted to watch.
She just wanted to do anything, I think, with animals. You know, and the world was her oyster. I think her plans were just to get the course done and then decide what direction she was going to take with it.
Being a typical teenager, it wasn't long before Louise's attention shifted towards other interests.
Louise always had a boyfriend, always interested in boys. She's a very pretty girl, so there was no reason for her not to have a boyfriend. But some boyfriends wasn't the right sort of boyfriend for her.
She went to college, and I think she had a boyfriend and she struggled a bit, and I think she just wanted to be with him a lot. She wasn't interested in anything else, you know, she just wanted to be with him.
It's like I'd rather talk to my boyfriend than my parents, you know what I mean? It was one of them. But certainly had had chats with her, the do's and don'ts. Not that she'd ever bloody listen to me, but yeah.
But in March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the UK, and a national lockdown meant that Louise would be spending more time isolated at her mum's house. Unable to see her new boyfriend, tensions started to grow at home, prompting Louise to pack a bag and move in with her cousin and her husband, Shane Mays, nearby. And to begin with, she seemed happy. But a few months later, everything changed.
After Louise moved in Lee Park, she was regularly texting her friends saying how they treated her like a child. Having had an argument, Louise left the home address on the 7th of May. She was contacted numerous times on her phone, I think over 50 times, and didn't respond. But at some point, Louise decided to go home and clear the air, and things were sort of getting back to normal.
After making up with her cousin and Shane, the following morning, Louise makes plans for a special national holiday.
On the 8th of May, which was actually Victory in Europe Day 2020, where there were lots of celebrations going in gardens, etc., in people's homes, that morning she woke up and she did a Snapchat around about midday saying that she's got, you know, a huge hangover, her head hurts as a result of drinking. It was established that Louise was going to meet her boyfriend at the skate park at around about 3 p.m. that afternoon. But we know that Louise didn't arrive at the skate park, and that's when concerns were being raised by her boyfriend.
Louise's cousin makes numerous attempts to call her mobile. But after an hour of phoning, the line disconnects. And by 6 p.m, Louise's cousin is left with no choice but to call 999.
Some details would have been taken by the call taker at that point to establish how high risk Louise was, so what were her vulnerabilities. Obviously, she was 16 years of age, so one would argue she's still a child and therefore vulnerable anyway. But we would also look at our records to see what we know about Louise. Some could say she was streetwise, only been missing 3 hours, not particularly alarming at that particular point, and there was no other information to suggest she would be high risk at that stage.
With the case considered fairly low risk, police don't arrive at Louise's cousin's address until 1 a.m. to write up a missing persons report.
And those inquiries would be basic inquiries, speaking to friends and family where she may be hanging out.
Shane explains to police that he accompanied Louise towards the skate park in Emsworth that afternoon before heading off in a different direction towards Tesco. Officers want to know if there could be any reason why Louise may have left of her own accord.
So if it came out that she had had a falling out, then the police may take the view, well, she's sulking, she's just going to be staying with a friend or hanging around the park or something overnight, teaching them a bit of a lesson to worry about, you know, and then she'll turn up safe and well in the morning.
But the following morning, there is still no signs of Louise.
I actually got a message saying Louise has gone missing, but lockdown was on. And I technically was in a different country. I didn't know if I could travel. I was trying to arrange things.
She'd never gone missing before. She'd obviously stayed at people's houses, but she always let people know where she was. I just thought, no, she hadn't. She's just it's drama. It was like, you know, I thought, no, perhaps she's just saying it, just letting everyone believe that she's gone missing. She's just staying at her friends, you know, she's hiding.
Yet as friends and family try to reach out to Louise with no luck, concern sets in.
It was completely out of character for her to disappear entirely, especially not be on her phone, because she was always on her phone. That was the scary thing. That was the thing that niggled in my mind, you know, and made me think, maybe something has happened, maybe something has happened. But I tried to block them thoughts out and think of it differently and go, no, she's just missing, she's going to turn up, because the alternative was just too upsetting.
In the Hampshire suburb of Lee Park, concern is growing for 16-year-old Louise Smith, who was last seen heading towards a nearby skate park the previous afternoon to meet her boyfriend. And with a missing person investigation underway, police attempt to paint a picture of Louise's life before she disappeared.
I would describe Louise as a typical 16-year-old girl. She was going through that phase with her mother where she was starting to rebel a little bit. She wanted her own independence. They would regularly have arguments at home. She wanted to spend more time with her boyfriend. And you've got to remember, this was at a time during the pandemic when lockdown was occurring, and so tensions were high in most households, I would suggest.
Police also take into consideration what else was going on during the day Louise vanished.
The day that Louise went missing was the 8th of May, which was VE Day, and that was being celebrated nationally. So there were lots of parties going on, but because this was lockdown, the government restrictions at that time meant that you could only celebrate in your garden. But there was a huge party atmosphere going on within the community. And again, as a police officer, you're thinking, well, perhaps Louise has gone to one of these parties, and maybe she's drunk a bit too much and she's sleeping it off. If she's gone to friends and it is during lockdown, then potentially the friends might be thinking, well, I may have committed an offence here during lockdown, and I don't want to tell the police that Louise is staying with me. So there's some additional difficulties at that particular time with that missing in person inquiry.
As the hours tick by, police dig deeper, questioning friends and family in the hope of finding clues into Louise's disappearance.
Louise was 16 years of age. She's vulnerable by definition of her age anyway. We know that she'd had problems at home in the past. We know that she'd had mental health problems, and also she was using alcohol. So all this information coming in really ramps up our concerns and makes her a high-risk missing person because of those vulnerabilities. And so her being out and not in contact with anyone is really concerning for me, because she's a risk, and not just to family members, but other people out there could take advantage of her.
And as night turns to morning, police issue an appeal to the public for sightings of Louise.
When she didn't materialise the following day, that's when the concerns were raised. And so, as you would normally do with a missing person inquiry, you would release details of Louise's image to the local media. You'd be asking for the public's help. Did you see Louise? Was she at one of these parties?
So I'm on a lot of Facebook groups, local Facebook groups around the area, and there was missing pages saying that, have you seen this girl? But yeah, it was just, my Facebook blew up with her face, basically. It was everywhere.
When we found out Louise was missing, I said we was all worried about her.
I just remember being there, missing posters, being around, everyone wondering what's happened and what's going on.
It certainly took off on social media, and the community were doing all they can to try and find Louise by reposting the appeals that the police had put out.
Police continue to focus their inquiries in the area where Louise was reportedly last seen, the Emsworth skate park.
Officers would be tasked to survey the area to see what CCTV cameras were in that area, going along the most obvious routes to take you to the skate park in Emsworth. We would capture that CCTV, which would be quite a time-consuming process, and then someone would have to review that footage.
And while police scour the area for CCTV, the local community also gets involved in the search for Louise.
A lot of people around Emsworth were looking for her, because obviously that was the last place she was seen. That was their centre point, and what I'm working out from there.
The community seemed to come together to try and sort of help everybody to sort of get through the situation that we were in.
There was people out all the time, in family and in the community of Lee Park. There was loads of people out and about looking for her. It was a massive, massive hunt. There was lots of volunteers as well looking for her.
I did go out in the car many times looking for her. I remember once that I thought I'd see her and I jumped out the motor, and I was hoping it was her, I think. And it did really look like her. Unfortunately, it wasn't her. But I wanted to do all I could for Louise in the hope that I was going to find her.
There was a hell of a lot of hope that Louise Smith was going to be found safe and well.
But as 2 days pass, there is still no signs of Louise.
As the case got on during the lockdown, there was no more news. It started to get a bit more escalated, and it definitely was an atmosphere in the local area.
The gut feeling was getting stronger and stronger that something serious had happened.
I think with any missing person inquiry, statistically, if someone isn't located within about 48 hours, the chances are they may not be alive.
I think I just didn't allow myself to think like that, because the hope of her still, of her turning up overrode everything out, because that was my only concern. I just wanted my little girl to turn up.
But it's when police look into the reason why Louise moved out of her mum's home at the start of lockdown, concern grows.
She'd had an argument with her mum, and she didn't like the boyfriend of the mum, who her mum used to call her stepdad. She didn't like him. She did not like him at all. So in the end, that's why she moved. That's why she moved out.
Could this revelation be in any way connected to Louise's disappearance? But after making their inquiries, police are able to rule out Louise's stepdad from the investigation. Attention then turns to Louise's boyfriend, who was due to have met her the afternoon of her disappearance.
We were told that Louise was intending to meet her boyfriend at the skate park in Emsworth at 3 p.m. that afternoon.
Her boyfriend was a nice guy. I dated him in year 9 for about a month. His little teenage little thing, just when you're kids, and we was good friends, and I see him sometimes around here.
But Louise's boyfriend claims she never turned up as arranged. So where did Louise go? With Louise's phone still switched off, police retrieve cell phone data to try to track her whereabouts on the day she went missing, to establish if she did walk to the skate park.
So we would expect to look at the call data and the cell site analysis to show that that's where her phone is moving. But actually what it did show was that it was moving in a completely different direction towards Havant Thicket. What a phone tells you is where the phone is. It doesn't necessarily tell you where the person is. So it could have been that Louise has lost her phone and someone's taken that phone and it's headed off in that direction. It could have been she'd been robbed and that phone's gone there. So always keeping an open mind.
6 days into Louise's disappearance, there's a sudden breakthrough. 2 people are arrested in Lee Park.
I was just shocked. It was something I just thought, this is something you see on the TV, this is something you read in papers, and I couldn't believe it. I was just gobsmacked.
Louise's cousin and her husband, Shane Mays, are taken in for questioning.
Both were interviewed at length by detectives at local police stations, and Shane was adamant that he had done nothing wrong. As far as he was concerned, he walked with Louise the route that he said he walked towards the skate park, where she was then going to meet her boyfriend at 3 o'clock, and that was the last he saw of her.
But for police investigating Shane's account, things don't add up. Having trawled hours of CCTV footage of the local area, there is no sign of Louise or Shane heading towards the skate park.
An alarm bells start to ring in relation to Shane Mays. You start questioning, well, why is he lying? I think once you establish that perhaps some lies have been told to the police by people that were responsible for caring for Louise at that time, concern starts to raise.
The latest evidence raises suspicion against Shane. But what led to his wife's arrest?
I think when you look at the fact that she reported her missing only 3 hours after sort of a last sighting of Louise, because for me, a 16-year-old not coming home at 6 o'clock in the evening is not particularly something to be concerned about, particularly when it's not the parents raising the alarm. When you layer that with the other information that we're getting, it's starting to paint a picture that is one of concern. So having exhausted pretty much our inquiries based around the account that Shane had given us and also looking at Louise's phone data, it got to the point where we had made a decision that Shane hadn't been completely honest with us around Louise's movements and her disappearance. And so the decision was taken to arrest both of them on suspicion of kidnap.
In Havant, 16-year-old Louise Smith has been missing for 6 days after she failed to meet her boyfriend at a local skate park. Analysis of phone records and CCTV has failed to show signs of Louise going there, and investigations soon rule out her boyfriend. But police have arrested Louise's cousin and her husband, Shane Mays, on suspicion of her kidnap.
So Shane Mays, I would describe, he was a 30-year-old man. He was out of work. His day consisted of pretty much getting up in the morning, going to the shops, returning home, and then spending numerous hours on his computer, playing games. Didn't appear to be actively looking for work.
Louise never said to me, oh, I'm scared of him or anything like that. She never said that to me. She never told me that.
With both Shane and his wife in custody, police conduct a search of their home for any sign of Louise.
The police would have been looking for obvious evidence, but also it would have been a forensic search as well. So we would have seized all of the clothing that would have been worn on that day. We would have gone through any computers that were there. We would have taken phones as well to establish their movements, see if there were any other phones that we weren't aware of.
Police find no evidence of Louise still in the house. So focus turns to Havant Thicket, since that was the last location of Louise's phone signal.
What it allowed us to do was then focus all of our resources in that area to really flush out, what clues were there and hopefully try and identify where Louise would be. And so there was a huge search operation going on over many days involving dogs, air support and boots on the ground looking for Louise or clues to establish where Louise may be. But also we could then move our media appeal to people that were using Havant Thicket on that day, VE celebration day, where a lot of people, would have been out getting their fresh air during lockdown and may have seen something suspicious. So we were really focusing on that area at that point.
While the search for Louise intensifies, police have no concrete evidence to prove Shane or his wife had anything to do with her disappearance.
A decision was taken to release them on bail, but with conditions that they reside elsewhere other than their home address. And so they were placed in a local hotel near to their home address, which gave us the time and space to actually conduct our inquiries at their home address without interference from either party.
You had a watch on 24 hours a day. There were 77 officers, vehicles surrounding the block. You had them knocking on doors in the general area, obviously trying to see if they could get any further information.
The police had been working on a theory of kidnap. But 13 days after going missing, everything changed.
Louise's body was found in the north of the thicket, covered up. Louise's body had been severely damaged, both by fire but also by violence, we believe. There was some attempt to cover up the body with sticks and wood. Clearly a fire had been set. It was fairly obvious at that point that this wasn't an accident, this wasn't self-harm, but this was a murder. We're just approaching the area where Louise's body was found, and you can see it's hugely dense here. You can't even see the footpath that we've just come off of, so you can only imagine what it would be like in the summer when you've got those really tall ferns around. So this is the site where sadly Louise was found, and I mean there's a fire that's taking place here. I think that's what saddens me about this. It should be an area where kids can come and play and have fun and relax and feel safe. But this kind of beautiful location has really been tarred now with this horrific attack.
With a body found, the crime scene is immediately locked down and preserved so the body can be formally identified and clues to a potential suspect can be uncovered. And a pathologist is called in.
I was asked to attend at Havant Thicket. It was very clear from quite a distance away that we were dealing with a severely burnt body. Thinking about the nature of the attack at the scene, it was simply obvious that there was some severe damage to the face. Now, that implied heavy impacts of some sort, and it was also clear that a stick had been inserted into the body. That's the sort of thing that could not possibly have happened accidentally. And so it was a question of identifying the particular stick and suggesting to the police how this might be managed. In this particular case, I said to them, I think what you need to do is to collect any DNA you can before anybody touches it.
With the true horror of the crime unfolding, the police need to know who could be responsible for such a callous and brutal killing.
As far as any more detail is concerned, there was really nothing much I could tell the police otherwise until we'd got on and got the body to the mortuary and examined in more detail.
And while Louise's remains are taken to the mortuary and DNA samples taken to the laboratory for examination, it isn't long before news reaches Louise's father while on his way to England to join the search.
We was about halfway on the journey when I got the call to say they'd found a body. I was told, you can't tell anyone, you can't tell anyone. You know, nobody, not even your family, in case they say something, because it could jeopardise the case. It was a very anxious journey because I just wanted to get here and, you know, see firsthand what was going on, what's happening.
I had somebody message me that they had seen a black private ambulance come out of the thicket. I got in the motor. I drove down to the thicket. Obviously, we weren't allowed into the thicket. I had my friend in the car with me, and there was just police everywhere. And I knew then that that was my Louise. I knew she'd gone.
I remember it vividly, but I got the family round because Bradley was coming down. He came in and told me in the kitchen, and I just broke down. I went, nah, it's not her. He went, Hayley's been a body found. I went, no, it's not her, it's not her. They got it wrong. It's not her. I just didn't think it would be.
The news that everyone feared spreads across the tight-knit community.
When I read the story on one of the local community pages saying that a body had been found, they couldn't reveal who it was, but parents of Louise had been told. And it was absolutely horrible.
The outpouring of grief was huge within the community, particularly on social media. There was a huge sense of upset and disbelief and I guess despair, really, you know, and I think the same for the police. You know, I think when you're dealing with a missing person inquiry, you're always hoping that you're going to find that person safe and well. And then when you do find a body, you know, it just punches you in the guts, really.
The hunt for Louise's killer is now on. And firmly in the police's sights is one man, Shane Mays. The person who had been looking after Louise.
What we found at about 3:10 that afternoon was an image of Shane Mays coming out of Havant Thicket and walking towards his mother's address, which is close by. Having said that, he was at the other end of the town near the skate park in Emsworth.
The CCTV evidence places Shane near the scene of the crime. And when police receive forensic evidence, there's a breakthrough.
Having carried out a number of examinations both at the crime scene and also through post-mortem examination on Louise, and also the search that we did back at the Mays flat, we were able to establish that we had a DNA match from Shane Mays on a wooden stick that was found at the crime scene near Louise's body. But also a speck of blood was also found on his trainers, which came back to Louise's DNA.
Shane Mays is rearrested, but this time he's charged with the murder of Louise Smith. His wife is also rearrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. At a hearing, Shane Mays pleads not guilty to murder, which means a trial will ultimately take place.
I'd say the pressure really starts at that point because you'll then set fairly quickly a trial date where you need to be trial ready. It's a painstaking process. You need to be 100% sure that that is the person that you say is the killer of your victim.
After further investigations and without any evidence against Shane's wife, she is released without charge. With all evidence pointing to Shane Mays and a trial now set, the question everyone wants the answer to is why would Shane want to brutally murder a 16-year-old girl living in his care? Shane Mays has been charged with the murder of 16-year-old Louise Smith after DNA and CCTV evidence linked him to the crime. While police prepare a case for trial, Louise's family and friends have the agonising task of saying goodbye to their loved one.
The day of Louise's funeral, there was hundreds and hundreds of people. People had gone out and put purple bows the night before her funeral on the lampposts.
The community just all pulled together. It was lovely. You know, they all stood out on the streets and right from outside her house right up to the crematorium.
Seeing everybody out there, it was overwhelming. For me, personally, being a very private person as well, it was also quite wonderful just to know that they were there. And Lou would have been looking down thinking, wow, I didn't realise I was so loved. And, you know, everyone was there, everyone. It was just, the world stopped just for a moment, just for her.
Six months after Louise's funeral, the trial is set to begin at Winchester Crown Court. But just as the court case begins, there's a surprising twist.
Day one of the trial, his defence team entered a plea for guilty to manslaughter. So effectively he was saying, I admit to killing Louise, but I didn't mean to do it.
He basically then admitted that he had taken her to have a chat and everything because they'd had a falling out the night before, and that he basically just wanted to chat with her. They argued, she hit him with a stick apparently, and then he attacked her because he lost his temper. He just lost control.
He said that he just hit her and punched her in the face and did what he did to her, horrific things. And then he said he walked away and he heard her moaning.
We examined that plea. We weren't happy with that. We were confident it was a murder. We were confident this was pre-planned. And so we stuck with our guns and said, no, this is a murder trial, and that's what we're going to be seeking for.
As the prosecution presents its case, the jury is shown a Snapchat video showing Shane tickling Louise's feet while she was staying with him.
Some of the things we heard in court was there was a lot of, flirting going on between Shane and Louise, and, she was still a child. He should not have been interacting with her in the way that he was. It wasn't appropriate at all.
But according to neighbours, Shane had a more aggressive side.
The feeling of my wife and I being around Shane Mays was one that we didn't want to be around him. Shane would be the sort of person, I believe, that would belt you for something if he thought you'd done something wrong. Running up the days to the incident, because they were upstairs neighbours, it was quite a lot of raised voices. A lot of it was targeted at Louise.
The court then hears how unhappy Louise really was while living at Shane Mays.
When it came out in court that she was reaching out to other people, she hadn't spoken to me about it. The only indication I ever got was one day she just said, look, I don't want to be here at the moment, Dad. I want to come up and see you. And as I said, lockdown stopped that plan, unfortunately. So it was horrible. It was an awful thing for me to deal with, because I just felt like I'd let her down.
2 days before Louise's disappearance, she phoned me and said she needed some lady products. And I believe that might have been a cry for help because she wasn't happy. And unfortunately, I blame myself that I let her down. And I do live with that, knowing maybe if I'd gone and took that to her, that she might have just opened up to me and told me.
The court has shown CCTV of Louise and Shane walking together the day before her murder.
The day before the incident, we actually saw them. Louise did actually say hello, but that was about all. She seemed very reserved. I think Shane was having a really bad influence on her, to sort of try not to speak to anybody just focusing on getting back up to their flat.
The prosecution reveals to the court horrific details from the post-mortem.
In Louise's case, the whole central part of her face and both jaws had been broken into many pieces. The lower jaw in a couple of places, and the upper jaw and the whole facial skeleton from the eyebrows down to the teeth broken into many pieces. Implication of that is that there have been some heavy blows from a heavy object. And the obvious thing in woodland would be a heavy branch of some sort, something of that kind. Large parts of the body had been burnt off. The upper limbs, the head, much of the chest, much of the belly wall at the sides especially, and to a certain extent at the front.
The level of damage to Louise's body meant it was almost impossible to establish a cause of death. But the most shocking bit of information was yet to come.
It was also clear that a stick had been inserted into the body. Something that I was asked about specifically was whether or not Louise was pregnant. Now, there was nothing left at autopsy to say that she might have been pregnant. The womb muscle itself was really quite well preserved. The lining of the womb that gives you a better idea of whether she might have been pregnant or not, all gone, long since vanished, so I couldn't say that. But the reason that's important is the assailant might have tried to disturb a pregnancy by putting a stick in there, and that suggestion was made.
After days of breaking down all their evidence to the courtroom, the prosecution pieced together the full horror of what likely occurred during the last few hours of Louise's life.
That morning, Louise woke up and she'd arranged to meet her boyfriend that afternoon at the skate park in Emsworth. So having seen her phone active around about midday, we know that Louise and Shane Mays left the address around about 1 o'clock.
But instead of heading in the direction towards the skate park, her phone signal moves towards Havant Thicket, revealing Louise's final movements on foot with her killer.
How did Louise end up going to the thicket on foot with Shane Mays? There's no suggestion that she was forced there or dragged there. The thicket itself is huge, and there are so many areas you can go to where you could not see anyone else. That started to show that this was pre-planned and that he lured Louise to that location that was remote with the intention of possibly sexually assaulting her.
At some point, Shane assaults and murders Louise and is seen on CCTV leaving the thicket at 3:30 p.m, heading towards his mum's house. Around 5 p.m, he arrives at Iceland Supermarket in Lee Park.
He went and bought some pizzas for both him, CJ and Louise, knowing that Louise was never going to be returning home to eat that pizza.
By 6:30 p.m, Shane's wife calls the police, reporting Louise missing.
Please, how can I help? I need to report a missing person. She's only 16. She's not come home.
But I think once the police became involved, I believe that he realised that at some stage we were probably going to locate Louise because her phone would show that she was in Havant Thicket. And so it's my belief that he returned to the crime scene at some stage, probably during nighttime hours so that he wouldn't be seen. And he then built effectively a bonfire over Louise and set fire to her, possibly using an accelerant to destroy the evidence, knowing that it's highly unlikely that you'd get a dog walker or a pedestrian walking through the thicket during the night reporting a small fire taking place.
He went back a couple of days after and finished her off. We're hoping that she died instantly so she wouldn't go through all that pain.
After a grueling 3-week trial at Winchester Crown Court, the jury returns its verdict. Shane Mays is found guilty of murder and is sentenced to 25 years in prison.
I don't believe he should ever get out. I've always been the one that says, you take a life, you should do a life.
I think capital punishment should be brought back. And I think they should lose their life like they took a life, but not straight away. I truly believe if you're sentenced to, as he was, 25 years, that he should serve that 25 years, knowing for that 25 years, at the end of that 25 years, he's going to die. Because that'll have to deal with him in his head all the time. It's a psychological thing. And to me, that's a fitting punishment.
With Shane Mays now behind bars, Louise's murder leaves a lasting mark on the local community.
Now I reflect on it and I think, I wished I'd done this or I wished I'd done that. But obviously what's done is done. I can't do nothing about it.
To think that something could happen of someone of her age, someone so young, dying of something so terrible, it makes you not want to walk the streets at night, especially as a female.
It's never going to be the same in our little community here, because what's gone on, it's been wicked, really.
There's definitely a dark cloud lingering, definitely a sense of mourning, I guess, of Louise. And every time I drive past the thicket now, I always look in. You just think to yourself, that's where it happened.
I don't think I could ever go there, and I don't really see many people go there when I drive past to go to the local shop. It's really much of a barren, kind of left alone area now.
And 2 years since her passing, family and friends try to come to terms to life without Louise.
The thing that sticks in my mind is the last minutes of her life. Was she scared? You know, she must have been scared. She must have been so scared. That's what really hurts me. I think she must be calling out for us and we couldn't get to her.
People say time will heal. It doesn't. Time allows you to cope better. And I am starting to cope a bit better now, but I'm not there. You know, sometimes I'll be having a good time. I'll be having a great day, and then I feel guilty. Because I'm like, why should I be happy? Yeah, it's awful. And the whole family try to get on with it, but all of us think about her daily. Of course we do. Of course we do. We miss her.
Reserve your spot on that sofa for a front row seat to Super Sunday. It's Liverpool v Man City and the tension will be through the roof. Sunday at 3 on Sky Sports for a 3:45 kickoff.
He just couldn't believe that he'd lost another son. Just really broke him.
When the villagers found out, they were shocked because it's such a quiet, peaceful village.
It was a pre-planned and well thought out murder.
In April 2003, the Nottingham village of Edwinstowe was shocked by the news that one of its residents had been found dead in the room of a local hotel, with his wrists and his neck elaborately bound. Was this a bondage session gone wrong? Or was it murder? In the heart of Sherwood Forest is the Nottinghamshire village of Edwinstowe. Legend has it that the village church was where Robin Hood married Maid Marian, and it still retained all of its charm.
Edwinstowe's a quiet village. It's a very tight-knit community, lots of very friendly people, people willing to talk to you on the street and help you out when you're in need.
On the evening of 25th of April 2003, panicked Edwinstowe resident Carol Croydon contacted her brother-in-law concerned about her missing husband, Philip.
I had a phone call from Carol asking me if Phil was with me. I said, no, he's not with me. Why was there a problem? She said he'd gone missing and she didn't know where he was. I was just a little worried because
it just wasn't like Phil to do that, to disappear without saying anything to anyone. I left it for probably 15, 20 minutes and thinking, what could have happened, where could he have gone? So I called Phil on his mobile. It went straight to Anne's phone as though his phone was switched off. After that, I rang Carol and said, look, I've tried to contact Phil. His phone's just gone straight to voicemail, and I don't know where he is. I contacted my sister, I think, then, and told her what was going off, but not to tell my parents, because the amount of stress they've suffered in the past with losing 2 other children. So I didn't want to worry them, so we kept it to ourselves that we couldn't find Phil and no one knew where he was.
Although he hadn't told his parents, Stephen did share his concerns with his sister.
He told me that Phil had gone missing and he'd been missing overnight, but I shouldn't worry about it because he'd spoken to Carol and Carol had said that she thought maybe Phil was suffering from depression.
Initially, Carol's assurances did the job of calming the family down, but it didn't last long, and they reported Philip missing to the police before going to bed.
I had a few hours sleep, and then when I woke in the morning, the first thing I did was to ring Carol to see if he'd turned up at home. He wasn't at home, and then I just rang his mobile again, and it went straight to Ant's phone again. At that point I decided maybe I should go and look for him, because if it fell out, he may have gone somewhere and just parked up for the night and spent the night in his car.
I came and parked down here on the Saturday morning about 8:30, because this is the area where myself and my brother used to fish all the time. I went over to the nature reserve area first, which is one of the popular fishing spots where we used to go. Couldn't see anything. Then went down to the church over there, nothing down there. I then drove across the bridge and down towards the river, searching all the lakes, but I couldn't see anything.
By now, Stephen's brother Philip had been missing for over 10 hours.
At that point I was very worried, because him not responding to any calls, not letting anyone know where he was, totally out of character for Phil. Normally, he's very family loving, and he wouldn't put us through any, especially my mum and dad, he wouldn't put us through that sort of stress. So at that point I feared there was something worse.
I'd just got flashes of my mum and dad running through my mind, thinking, how they're going to cope, losing another brother, another son.
In the early hours of the 26th of April, a shocking discovery was made 36 miles from Edwinstowe.
We received a phone call from an employee of a hotel that had found a body in a bedroom of the hotel. Officers arrived at the room in question, and it was immediately apparent that there was blood at the scene, and the man himself had got his hands tied. He'd also got a scarf across his eyes, at the back of his head. It's certainly an unusual set of circumstances.
Immediately, police set about organising what they believed to be a crime scene.
Police officers took steps to secure the corridor and the room itself so that no one else was allowed anywhere near it. The senior officer called out for the forensic services and the pathologist to attend the scene. Certainly they spent some considerable time there taking samples for fingerprints, DNA, fibres, that sort of thing. It was apparent from the amount of blood around that it was a suspicious incident. We were able to identify the man, Mr. Philip Croydon, and that was from his driving licence.
Philip's wife Carol and his family were completely unaware that their worst fears had been realised, but it was the police's job to inform them of the news.
When officers told Carol Croydon that her husband had been found dead in a hotel, she was clearly very distressed.
She was hysterical at the time. She was really, really distraught. She couldn't understand what he'd been doing in a hotel room, and she wanted answers.
Unaware their brother had been found dead, Stephen and Sandra were on their way to Carol's in Edwinstowe to make sure she was okay.
I received a call and was on the way up there to say that Phil had been found in a hotel and he was dead.
It was such a shock that I kind of panicked a little bit, but it's happened and we've got to go and face and find out what the story is.
Stephen and Sandra continued their journey to see their sister-in-law.
When we got to the house, Carol was there. She was upset, but probably not as upset as the rest of us.
When we walked in the house, there were I think there were probably 5 or 6 police officers there, because Carol had fed him the information that Phil was depressed. So Steve said, I hope he hasn't committed suicide. Obviously thinking about my mum and dad again, Steve, we need to tell my mum and dad. And so the 2 police liaison officers drove with us up to my mum and dad's house.
First went to the parents' address, to Ted and Marg, and the rest of the family were all at their house. I was with a colleague at the time. There was brother and sister, Steve and Sandra. Employed as a family liaison officer, involved with interaction with the victim's family, to interview them about the victim, the lifestyle, the background of that person, and to liaise with them and keep them fully updated with every step of the investigation.
My dad knew straight away that something bad was wrong, and I told him that Phil had died. My dad was probably worse than my mum. He was absolutely distraught. He was in bits. Just kept saying, God, why? Just didn't. He couldn't deal with it. I think with losing 2 sons before that, he just couldn't believe that he'd lost another son. So, just really broke him.
Despite having just received the heartbreaking news about their son, Philip Croydon's parents' thoughts quickly turned to his widow.
Carol stopped and spoke to my dad and my mum for a little while, and then made her excuses, saying she had a headache and she wanted to go to bed, and would I help her to get in bed. My dad kissed Carol as she went upstairs to bed, and told her to try and get some rest.
The family grieved and tended to a distraught Carol.
I went and helped her get undressed and put some pyjamas on and get into her bed, while we all sat downstairs, discussing and kind of guessing what might have happened to Phil.
In the hotel, the police investigation was unearthing more details surrounding Philip Croydon's death.
The Home Office pathologist arrived at the scene, examined the body of Mr. Croydon, and it became apparent that he'd received numerous stab wounds to the back of the neck and also to the chest. The ties that had been tied to his wrists and the scarf that had been placed over his head, it was his opinion that these had been placed or tied on after death. They were so tight that there was no discoloration of the wrists, or no reaction when they were untied. And in relation to the scarf that had been placed over his head, he suggested that that would have fallen off in an assault. So it was quite clear that this had happened after death. And it was our opinion that whoever had done this had wanted to make it look like a sexually orientated assault.
Now police were certain they had a murder case on their hands. And whilst Carol was grieving with the Croydon family, they checked a new potential lead. CCTV footage of the previous night from the hotel cameras was found and examined. It showed Philip Croydon entering the hotel alone at 5:09. What officers were hoping was that it would identify Philip Croydon's killer. The police were one day into investigating the death of Philip Croydon from the Nottinghamshire village of Edwinstowe. He'd been found in a local hotel room with multiple stab wounds and his hands and neck bound. Philip's wife Carol had reported him missing on the night of the killing. Police had already concluded this wasn't a sex game gone wrong, but murder, and they hoped the hotel's CCTV footage would help with their inquiries.
As two detectives viewed CCTV footage from the hotel.
Armed with the details of all the Croydon family vehicles, 20 minutes after Philip had checked in, police made a surprising discovery.
Mrs. Croydon's car was seen entering the hotel on the Friday evening, and a lady who got out of the car fitted the description of Mrs. Croydon. That was clearly very irregular to what she'd said to us about where she was the night before and the fact that her husband was out playing cards.
Then officers saw Carol leaving in different clothes 40 minutes later.
The two officers spoke to the senior investigating officer and immediately then went to Edwinstowe, saw Mrs. Croydon, and she was arrested on suspicion of murder.
The family liaison officer, Matt Spradbury, was there to see the reaction to this new turn of events.
It was a massive shock to the family that she'd been arrested on suspicion of his murder.
I couldn't believe it. I said, look, you've got to be wrong. This can't be right. You've made a mistake. I just couldn't believe that she'd done it.
All the police activity outside the Croydon house in Edwinstowe started to attract attention in the village.
So the village of Edwinstowe is a very nice, quaint, leafy village, very close to Sherwood Forest. It's a lovely place to live, and for journalists there was a massive interest, and for us we obviously covered it every single day.
Carol Croydon was taken to Wigston Police Station in Leicester to explain how she happened to be checking into the same hotel as the husband she had reported missing.
The police obviously looked into her story, and they looked at the CCTV from the hotel, and there was Carol Croydon at the hotel. Apparently she had no knowledge that her husband was there, and she was going to see him, and she was also filmed leaving the hotel. Police could then prove that she did know where he had been.
She was obviously aware that officers had got her going into the hotel on CCTV. She told police officers that she'd gone there to meet her husband to engage in a swingers session with another couple who were called Brian and Linda.
Whilst Carol was being interviewed in custody, the family wanted as many updates as possible and were waiting eagerly to find out whether there were going to be any charges against her. I had contact with Philip's brother Stephen in the main, and he was adamant that I made a personal visit to them to keep them updated no matter what time it was.
Carol Croydon said that she left the hotel room, she left Brian and Linda in the hotel room with her husband, and that she'd lost her nerve and gone.
This didn't sit right with me at all, because Phil just isn't like that. Never would have even entered his mind to do anything like that.
Phil was very quiet and very shy, and certainly that was totally out of character. So then that made me think, what has she done?
The police went on the hunt for Brian and Linda, the swingers from room 328.
Whilst Mrs. Croydon was being interviewed, officers were checking the CCTV footage of the hotel. There was no evidence whatsoever of anyone else going into the room where Mr. Croydon was found. So it soon became very apparent to officers on the investigation that Mrs. Croydon was telling us a lie.
Whilst the family tried to come to terms with events, and after the police had failed to find Brian and Linda on the hotel CCTV, they expanded their investigation to Carol's house in Edwinstowe.
Mrs. Croydon was in custody. There's a lot of actions that are going on behind the scene. We have a lot of detectives who are working on this case.
3 days after Philip's death, the police made a discovery.
Officers carried out a forensic search of her home address and found in a dustbin a carrier bag which contained blood marks, which subsequently, upon testing, turned out to be the blood of Mr. Croydon.
The police continued their search, uncovering plane tickets to Dublin for Carol and a male passenger flying 2 days after Philip's death. With this new evidence, they questioned Carol again.
She was asked about a number of contacts that were held in a mobile phone. There was a gentleman in the contacts that she described as being a friend and a shoulder to cry on. However, behind the scenes, officers were making inquiries into the various individuals concerned, and this particular individual, it soon became apparent from what officers found that he was more than just a casual friend, if you like, and possibly somebody that she may have been having some sort of relationship with.
It wasn't long before Carol changed her story.
When she was further interviewed, she introduced this person to us as somebody that she was having a relationship with. Mrs. Croydon told police officers that her boyfriend had come to the hotel, come into the room and told her to leave, later meeting up with him in the evening. He then told her that she wouldn't be seeing her husband again.
Police acted fast, and Carol's lover was arrested.
The following interview, she then actually changed her story and actually said to police officers that her boyfriend burst into the hotel room and stabbed her husband Philip several times, and she actually witnessed him do that. So we've got a change, if you like, of the two interviews, from actually letting him in and asking him to leave to, secondly, from actually watching him do it. She was asked, how did her boyfriend get into the room? How did he burst into the room? She was unable to answer that.
Could it be that Carol is so enmeshed with her lover? Is she wanting to protect him? Is she covering for him? And would that explain why actually the stories so far really haven't been very believable at all?
While Carol's lover was in custody, the police were checking out his movements at the time of the murder.
We're able to actually eliminate her boyfriend through his mobile phone, which actually put him in a different part of the country, and he couldn't possibly have been anywhere near the incident scene.
The police looked into his story very carefully to discount him from the murder, and they proved that it would have been impossible for the lover to get to the hotel in time and leave. They retraced his route very carefully, they timed it, and they made it sure that they could prove that he was not involved.
Philip's family continued to be kept informed of events by police.
It was like as if Phil had died all over again, because the first story obviously wasn't true. So then she was telling us this. So then it was like putting us through that torture of losing Phil all over again, but in a different way.
Once we discovered that her boyfriend could not possibly have been involved with the murder, he was released from custody. We then presented the evidence that we'd got so far to the CPS, who proposed that we charge Mrs. Croydon with murder.
After 13 separate interviews, and 5 days since Philip Croydon's body was discovered in room 328, his wife Carol was charged with murder.
There was sort of a sense of relief there that, you know, we knew what had happened.
News of the murder charge against Carol quickly spread through the community.
When the villagers found out, they were shocked, because it's such a quiet, peaceful village. Everybody were talking about it at that time, because it was so unusual.
Police started to build a picture of the days leading up to Philip Croydon's death. But to establish murder, they would have to prove Carol had a motive.
We made inquiries at Carol Croydon's place of work, and CCTV showed that she left at 2 minutes to 5. She'd actually signed out at 5:20. We thought that showed some sort of planning on her behalf to buy herself some 20 minutes of time.
With Carol in custody, the police continued with their investigation.
We made inquiries at Carol Croydon's place of work, and it became apparent that there was a knife missing, some sort of cheese knife, but we were never able to fully establish the time it went missing.
On the morning of the 25th of April 2003, police believed Carol left home for work with a number of neckties and a change of clothes in her possession. Had Carol set out that day with murder on her mind? The case was building, but who knew what was around the corner? In Nottinghamshire, police were dealing with a murder investigation that was continually changing direction, but they were determined to find the truth. 5 days after Philip Croydon had been found stabbed in a hotel room near the village of Edwinstowe, his wife Carol had been charged with his murder. She'd already changed her story on 3 occasions, wasting police time and resources, but there was more to come. Whilst Carol was on remand awaiting trial, yet another version of events emerged. She now said Philip had asked her to tie him up.
As a child, she'd been sexually abused by various people. She said that she'd had flashbacks to her childhood, which caused her to inflict the stab wounds to her husband, which subsequently killed Mr. Croydon.
At this stage, it's quite clear that Carol has committed the killing. So really, the only other option for her is to try and get a reduced sentence by saying that it was diminished responsibility.
Carol blamed flashbacks to her childhood, and that had sent her into a blind rage, and she couldn't remember doing anything, but just found herself standing over Phil's body, and Phil was dead.
I've worked with a lot of patients who have flashback phenomenon, and they are very strong, vivid memories. What tends to happen though is that people go back to how they felt whilst that memory was formed. So what I would expect was for Carol to have felt small, helpless, immobilised with fear.
With Carol now claiming she hadn't committed murder, it was the police's job to prove it was premeditated. So they looked into Carol and Philip's life together in the search for a motive.
Carol's past was always kind of kept a bit of a, not a secret, but she never wanted to discuss it. And if you asked her questions about her past, which you could tell made her feel uncomfortable, she would move on to another subject.
Philip Croydon and Carol got married on the 17th of June 2000 at St Peter's Church in the Derby suburb of Chellaston.
Our first impressions were good. I mean, Phil was obviously clearly madly in love with her, even though he'd not known her for very long. Carol was seemed very friendly, but she was a little bit secretive about her past and her family. We knew she'd been adopted, she told us that much, but that was about all she did tell us.
Philip's father told me during my interview with him that he didn't know very much about Carol's background or much about her, and he potentially wasn't too trusting with her.
Phil kind of changed a little bit. I got the feeling that she was feeding him, this is what you should do, this is what you should say.
Police discovered that Philip went out of his way to try and give Carol everything she desired.
She was very materialistic. Everything with Carol was all about money, and how people might perceive her, down to the car that she had, the pedigree cats that she had. Everything was all about how it looked to other people.
This was also noted by family liaison officer Matt Spradbury.
They both had, at the time, brand new Toyota sports vehicles. The home address was beautifully furnished and a very nice big house. It's quite clear that Carol liked to have nice clothes as well from some of the search work we did, and liked to have nice things in her life.
The investigation continued, and officers uncovered that Carol's lavish lifestyle with Philip was in stark contrast to her upbringing.
There's no doubt that Carol had not come from ideal circumstances. That leads me to think that maybe she'd inherited some sort of predisposition towards antisocial behaviour. Or at the very least, maybe her early experiences in those first 2 years of when she was still with her mother and her father were so damaging that it affected her ability to form close, meaningful attachments to people in her life, and particularly men in her life.
Philip's family may have been unaware of Carol's background, but they were now under no illusions that she had killed Philip.
The police had just drip-fed us the information as time had gone on, and each time she'd changed the story. I think it wasn't a shock what she'd done, because we knew a different person to the person that she was portraying.
When the pathology report came back, it didn't seem to point to a vulnerable woman who was protecting herself as she was claiming.
Carol entered room 328, where her husband was waiting. She performed a sex act on her husband, and then she got a 4-inch cheese knife out of her bag and began to stab him.
On examination of Mr. Croydon, found that he'd been stabbed 22 occasions, 2 to the chest, 20 to the neck area.
Philip Croydon bled to death. He had superficial cuts to his left hand that implied that he'd tried to grasp the blade as it was plunged into him, and that he'd possibly been trying to fight back to save his life.
The attack was very frenzied, but then it had to be in order to get Philip dead quickly so that he couldn't overpower her, maybe use the knife against her in self-defence. So she had to be committed to a very, very brutal and sudden attack, and she was. She severed his spinal cord with one blow, so she wasn't taking any chances.
This horrific attack on Philip had been carried out with a cheese knife that fitted the description of one that had gone missing from Carol's workplace a few weeks before.
Here we've got a direct link between Carol and the murder weapon. Now, I can imagine why somebody planning a night of romps with their husband might pack neckties and scarves, but pack a cheese knife? That's something that's a bit more difficult to explain.
With Carol's stories not adding up, ascertaining what was fact and what was fiction in Carol Croydon's life wasn't proving to be simple for police. Carol Croydon was accused of murdering her husband Philip and leaving him tied up in a Nottinghamshire hotel room, trying to make it look like a bondage session gone wrong. Having already changed her story numerous times, Carol was now claiming diminished responsibility due to a life of abuse. Police were still busy trying to prove a motive and thus murder.
There just seemed to be no motive whatsoever for killing her husband, except that she stood to inherit the £300,000 family home in Edwinstowe and an insurance policy.
Police carried on with their investigations and went through the hotel bookings on the night of the killing.
A neighbouring couple who were in the next room to Mr. Croydon reported hearing noises at the relevant time of the incident and a voice saying, "Don't, don't."
Officers continued trying to prove that Carol's motive was financial. Looking into her and Philip's relationship was key to their case.
He met Carol at work. Carol went there as an accountant, and after a short period of time they developed problems with the company. Carol was fired from her position. Phil was that much in love with her. He felt that he had to give his notice in as well, so they both went at the same time.
Detectives soon discovered a side to Carol that she'd kept hidden from everyone, including her besotted husband.
She'd made a lot of false statements, if you like. She'd got a false driving licence in terms of her date of birth. Her birth certificate had been falsified, again with the date of birth. Her passport, even a national insurance number. She'd made herself appear 4 years younger than what she actually was. She was also, it was found that she'd applied for an accountancy course and falsified her qualifications. That enabled her to get a role later on in life as an accountant. Clearly, there's a lot of things going on in the background here that just didn't add up with Mrs. Croydon.
What police were discovering was that Carol Croydon's whole life was nothing more than a tangled web of lies. What they needed to do was prove that her claim of diminished responsibility was just another one.
Carol said that she'd been abused, sexually abused, physically abused throughout her life and by various different men. It might provide some sort of reason for why she's so willing to really take advantage of any of the men in her life and why she was angry towards her partner to the extent that actually divorcing him wasn't enough. She wanted to kill him.
After an investigation lasting more than 6 months, the police believed they had enough evidence to convict Carol of murder. But it would all be meaningless if her defence could prove diminished responsibility. On January the 28th, 2004, the case against Carol Croydon went to Nottingham Crown Court.
She was brought into court, sat in the dock, very calmly, as all the charges were read out to the jury. There was one charge, obviously, was murder. I just remember her being very, very calm and cool in the circumstances. She was facing a murder charge.
The prosecution presented their case, witnesses came and gave their evidence. The defence went down the line of provocation. Mrs. Croydon was suggesting that her childhood she'd suffered sexual abuse by a number of people and that she'd suffered provocation into murdering her husband.
The whole of Philip's family were in court from the first day.
Carol didn't show any emotion. When she stood there was just a look of fear, but not any emotion showing at all. It was just like shock that she'd been caught.
The extent of Carol's colossal amount of lying was laid out in every detail for the jury.
There's only one witness to the crime, obviously, which was Carol Croydon, and she didn't give evidence about that. So the jury were reliant on the explanations that she gave to the police at the time, and there were varying explanations as to what happened and what her involvement was that changed. And that was probably one of the most interesting parts of the case, about how she had told lie after lie to the point where she couldn't remember what happened.
To be a good liar, you have to construct a very plausible lie, and then you have to stick to it really quite rigidly. And this is where she comes unstuck, because Carol has to have points for flair and imagination, but when it comes to consistency and believability, she really does fall down. She's too much of a fantasist.
The jury then heard Carol's final version of events.
Mrs. Croydon admitted that she'd stabbed her husband many, many times, but she'd had a blackout, and that when she came to, she was just standing over his body and couldn't actually recall the actual incident itself. This was viewed by a psychiatrist in court as being very unusual in the circumstances. He said it was possible, but he doubted it. She's fitted each account to try and deceive, and hopefully she was hoping to get away with convincing people, but obviously when she's presented with the truth, she has to change her story.
The prosecution introduced the evidence from the crime scene, starting with the pathology report.
The pathologist in court found the neckties around his wrists had not been soaked in blood, which implied that it had been tied around his wrists after he'd been attacked.
What the chambermaid saw would have appeared to a layperson as a sexual misadventure, a sexually motivated offence. But actually, it doesn't take too close an inspection to work out that it's not all as it seems. And when a crime scene has been cleverly constructed to look like something it isn't, there's a reason for that. Somebody wants to distance themselves. So if somebody wants to distance themselves from a murder, the chances are that they're actually very, very close. And you can't be more close to this murder than a husband and a wife.
Sitting in court, Carol's web of lies were harrowing for Philip's loved ones.
We all went every day for nearly 3 weeks. Some days it was difficult. You know, you didn't want to get in the car, you didn't want to go and listen to the information that you knew you were going to have to sit through again, and kind of see my mum and dad's faces and how everybody felt, and it was very upsetting and very draining, and obviously something that took the family years and years to get over, and I really don't think my dad ever got over it.
Towards the end of the trial, the prosecution called in a psychologist to talk about Carol's alleged state of mind at the time of the killing.
Carol says that she was very, very depressed. She was depressed as a result of problems in her marriage, and she was depressed as a result of trauma in her history. But the classic symptoms of depression are lack of libido, lack of motivation, lack of concentration and ability to plan ahead, general purpose apathy. Now that's actually the antithesis of what we're seeing with Carol, because this is somebody who was able to plan and execute a murder and also maintain several affairs.
What the jury was told by the expert witness was to be key in the case against Carol Croydon.
It's concluded that Mrs. Croydon couldn't have been suffering from any mental disability or depression at the time of the killing.
With that, Carol Croydon's defence of diminished responsibility collapsed. It was the moment Philip's family had been waiting for.
At this point during the trial, they were now beginning to think, she's responsible for this, and they just wanted that justice to be done.
After almost a 3-week trial, a jury of 7 women and 5 men retired to consider Carol Croydon's various accounts of the events on the evening of the 25th of April 2003. After just 3 hours, they'd reached a verdict.
On February 12, 2004, Carol Croydon was convicted of the murder of her husband at Nottingham Crown Court. She broke down uncontrollably in the dock when the jury came back with the verdict. She clutched a tissue to her head.
I think when the judge found her guilty, I'm sure I screamed. It was panic. I was thankful that she'd been found guilty, but at the same time, you know, still kind of just thinking about Phil and what, you know, we were never going to see him again.
On convicting Mrs. Croydon, the judge said in his summing up that he was quite satisfied that she'd committed a sex act on him, got him at his weakest point, and it was at that point that she murdered him.
The judge sentenced Carol to life imprisonment set at a minimum term of 16 years. He told her that she was a cold-hearted, cold-blooded killer who tried to blame others for being responsible for her husband's murder.
This Carol Croydon case wasn't a sudden loss of self-control during an argument. It was a pre-planned and well-thought-out murder.
All along, Carol's allegations of abuse had just been more lies. Philip's family struggled to see the 16-year sentence as justice.
The sentence can never be long enough for anyone to do something like that, to take another life deliberately and never show any remorse, which she hasn't. She's never ever admitted to it, never shown any remorse, never apologised. And to do something like that, my opinion is people who are 100% guilty, there's no doubt whatsoever, they should stay in prison the rest of their life.
When she was found guilty, she sat in the dock and she sobbed, presumably for the fact that she wouldn't be able to live the great life that she'd led in the past, not for the fact of she'd taken our brother away from us, and she killed him in such a horrible way that would be emblazoned on all our minds forever.
After the verdict, Philip's dad, Ted Croydon, read a statement in which he said, "I curse this woman every day I wake. I call on God that she cannot sleep, that she knows no peace of mind, that her food is harsh in her mouth and without taste, that her thirst cannot be quenched, that she sees no sun or the beauty of nature, that she hears no bird's song." He added, "That woman is the devil incarnate, nothing but an evil witch."
I absolutely hate her as much as I did the day that she did it. I hate her just as much, not just for what she did to Phil, but what she's put my family through. It's unforgivable. My father was never the same. It ruined his life, it changed him completely. He was a broken man. He died a broken man. I'll never ever forgive her for that.
Because Carol Croydon refused to take the stand, no one will ever know for certain what happened in room 328 on the 25th of April 2003. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of the whole case is that Carol's lover left his wife and at time of sentencing still wanted a future with her, despite the fact that she named him as the killer, hoping to evade justice.
Clock in for startling footage exposing the reality of frontline policing Saturday at 9 in Brickham. Emergency on our streets.
Two brutal killings, a massive manhunt, and it shocked the whole town.
The officers went to the 7th floor flat, saw this man holding a sawn-off shotgun. He went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. The press in London called him Spider-Man.
On the night of January the 23rd, 1995, Lancashire police were called to a garage in Morecambe. What they discovered there could have been the scene from a horror film. The investigation into what turned out to be a brutal double murder and the ensuing manhunt for the killer would take the police all over the country. It was a case that the police and the people of Morecambe would never, ever forget. In January 1995, Morecambe, a picturesque seaside town in Lancashire, was about to become front-page news when the dead body of a man was found. DCI Graham Gooch from Lancashire Constabulary was to lead what would become an unprecedented investigation.
On the night in question, I was the duty on-call senior investigating officer, but sound asleep in bed, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone went, which means something awful's happened somewhere. So took the call and they said they'd had a murder at Morecambe.
The officers had been faced with a gruesome scene at a garage on the Whiteland industrial estate. The dead body had been severely battered.
They tell you basically what's happened, and then you start thinking, what am I going to need? Where shall I rendezvous with the officers on the scene? And start the process rolling.
DCI Colin Mooney was appointed as Deputy Senior Investigating Officer on the case, an unusual one for this normally quiet holiday resort.
Morecambe's quite a low crime area to live in, particularly compared with other areas of Lancashire. It's got a great beach, and it's got the estuary, There's a famous walk across the Morecambe Bay, a guided walk.
It's not the big razzmatazz of Blackpool, no big rides and things like that, but it has its own lovely appeal. The Queen Mother once came to Morecambe and described Morecambe's view as a $65,000 view.
I would say Morecambe's probably one of the very safest places to live. It's sort of like a bit of a sleepy town. There's not really that much horrendous trouble, you know.
The wives of 49-year-old Tony Morocco and 29-year-old Paul Sandham had phoned the police, worried about their husbands who had worked at the garage together and not returned home.
They were creatures of habit. They'd finish their work about 5 o'clock and go home. And this night, they hadn't. The officers went to the garage with the relatives, and it was locked. And then they found somebody who's got a key to come along and unlock it. So the premises were locked. And inside, then they'd found this scene of destruction. Clearly, it looked as though someone had been playing dodgems with the cars, and there was smashed office furniture, smashed cabinets. And on the floor was the body of Tony Morocco.
Tony's body, unfortunately, bore considerable marks of violence. It looked as though he'd been stabbed and that his head had suffered a number of blows from a blunt instrument.
Well, certainly the amount of violence used was far in excess of that was needed to actually bring about death. There was something very emphatic about it, almost as if the person was acting out, I know, some sense of mission or getting revenge.
From his injuries, it was immediately clear to police that Tony Morocco had been brutally murdered on the premises of his own business. After pathologists had analysed the scene, his body was carefully removed, and along with crime scene investigators, DCI Gooch tried to figure out what had happened.
Left at the scene, there was a lot of blood there. There was a torque wrench, which had blood and traces of body on it and hair. So that appeared to be a fairly obvious murder weapon. And lots of other pieces, because garages are generally fairly messy places, so there's a lot of stuff to look at. But then here we had the feature of this car, this Toyota car, which had obviously crashed into the desk and into the cupboards. So clearly that was part of whatever had happened at the scene. So we knew that we had to do a lot more investigation into that. But of course the first thing on your mind is, who did this?
The police didn't have to look far for their first suspect.
The situation we had was these two men who worked together in the garage. They hadn't come home. We've been along there and we found the body of one of them and the other man's missing. It's not unreasonable to have some suspicion that they'd fallen out and had a terrible argument and that this was the result of it. Because, I mean, Paul Sandham was nowhere to be found. He hadn't gone home, which was most unusual.
The police immediately focused on locating Paul Sandham.
Officers have been called out to come to Morecambe to start forming an investigation team. In the morning, those officers had turned up about 8, 9 o'clock, and we'd started the briefing, painting the scene for them to tell them what was going on, what we were going to do, and what each of them would be doing. And then, during that briefing, in came one of the officers saying, "Hang on, boss, I think there's been a development," and hands me a piece of paper saying the body's been found further, just out in the countryside, a little way from Morecambe. And then we found out that that was Paul Sandham, who had been stabbed many, many times.
The man police had been treating as a suspect had been left for dead with 41 knife wounds.
There was a clear connection between the two victims, and also the level of violence used on both of them was quite similar. It did bring into focus the fact that there had been a deliberate separation of the two victims, which of course highlighted just how calculated it was. At this point, then, we realised that we had a double murder on our hands.
It was inconceivable that two people who worked so closely together, who went missing at about the same time and both found murdered, would not be linked.
I've dealt with murders before with more than one victim. They don't come very often, but it does change things completely from what we were looking at before. Before we were looking for possibly a murder with a reasonable suspect. Now suddenly you've got a double murder with no suspect. And it was a great concern to local people.
I spent most of my working life on the estate from being the age of 13. You know, I got to know Tony, you know, just through, you know, being on the estate like I got to know everybody else. He was a lovely guy. If anybody was going to say, you know, put Tony in a room of 10 other people, you know, who would get murdered, you know, you wouldn't put Tony, you'd say, well, what's he doing here? It was that shocking that, you know, it was just beyond belief, really.
The local press, the local radio, everybody was covering this big stuff, which was very helpful because it was a big story.
We've got here 2 brutal killings, a massive manhunt, something the like of which Morecambe had never seen before. And we were in the centre of it, being the town's newspaper, and we were swept up by it, and without a doubt we realised the enormity of the story and that we had to rise to this challenge.
Lancashire police had 2 dead bodies on their hands and no idea who could have committed the murders. The most dramatic investigation they had ever been faced with was about to commence. Police in Morecambe were dealing with a brutal double murder and no suspect. The body of Tony Morocco had been found at his garage business, and his co-worker Paul Sandham was found a mile down the road in a field. He'd been stabbed 41 times.
When people learned of what had happened to Tony and Paul, it was just pure shock. Or anybody on the estate could quite believe what had happened. It was unreal, just unreal.
Tony Morocco was very well known. He had a wide circle of friends and a big customer base. His partner Paul probably was lesser well known, but he'd obviously known to all the customers.
Sad thing for Paul. Paul had just recovered from cancer. You know, had gone through a grueling time with that. You know, to have his life pulled away from him in one flash of it, you know, it was absolutely shocking.
After speaking to friends and family, police started investigating Tony's business, hoping to find a clue that would lead them to the murderer.
The kind of work that Tony was involved in, the purchase and sale of low-value vehicles, indicated to us that it was largely a cash business, but there was no cash found on the body. So we did some checks, and we were right that there should have been some cash there. It looked like a robbery might have been the motive. In addition to that, Mrs. Morocco was able to tell us that Tony had a heavy gold chain around his neck, which he never took off, I think for sentimental reasons, except for just one occasion when he'd broken a link and it was repaired by a local jeweller. And that was missing as well.
Armed with their evidence, police began building a picture of what could have happened on that fateful night.
It became apparent to us that Paul Sandham had been taken away and murdered first. We guessed that this Toyota car had been used to take him away, presumably on a test drive. And he killed him in the field and then come back in the Toyota and crashed it into the garage when he arrived. We tend to assume that he'd gone along there, found 2 members of staff there, which he thought he couldn't overcome them. So on the pretext of wanting to buy a car, had got Paul Sandham away and killed him so he could go back and rob Tony.
Regardless of their theory, police still needed concrete evidence that the murders were linked and the Toyota car was significant.
It's very important to isolate the two scenes to make sure there's no contamination, because we wanted to find out if that car had been in the field. So we found next to the road, we got a tyre track, which eventually found matched the Toyota, but also, more importantly, we found soil of identical makeup in the footwell of the car as was in the entrance to the field. Now, the important thing was this was found on the driver's side and not the passenger side. So it showed only one person who had been out of the car got back into it, and that was the driver. And that had gone back to TM Motors.
For me, more significantly, there was a trainer mark in mud in the field close to Paul Sandham's body. And there was also a similar trainer mark in blood in T&M Motors. So it was clear to us that the murders were linked, and they feel the trainer mark was a definite scientific link between those two murders.
With the crashed Toyota car left at the garage, police needed to establish how the killer had travelled around.
One of the lines of inquiry which we had was to try to establish whether or not there was a getaway vehicle involved and whether or not anybody had seen it. The only thing that we could find out was that somebody dimly recalled seeing a pedal cycle propped up against the wall outside T&M Motors. And to be honest, I don't think that the police put a great deal of store by that at the time, because who goes to commit a murder on a pedal cycle?
One of the members of staff of the garage who worked there part-time came in to help us, and he checked to see that all the cars were there, and he found there was one missing. And this was a white MG Metro, which was probably the best of the bunch of cars that were in the garage, and that one was missing. Not only was the car missing, but also the paperwork, the logbook and the receipts and that for the vehicle. So clearly the murderer had not only just taken the car as a getaway, he'd also made sure he got all the documents for it. So clearly he probably intended to move the car on later, and that was important to us. I mean, it tells you a lot about the person you're looking for, that this isn't somebody who's just done something on the spur of the moment. The fact that he's lured one man away to kill him just so he can go back and do a petty robbery shows this is a dangerous and determined person.
DCI Gooch had another suspicion about the murderer's connection to the crime scene.
Did he know the garage? Had he been there before? You take the idea, he wouldn't have come from a million miles away. It's fairly tucked away on the White Lund estate. It's something somebody local would have known, or somebody who knew the area very well. He wouldn't have just turned up there from a long way away and gone there on spec.
With the white Metro missing, they now had a vehicle to look out for. The car was placed on the police national computer as a vehicle of interest and also flagged with other relevant organisations.
There is an organisation which members of the public and car dealers can use to check whether or not a vehicle is stolen. We contacted that organisation and asked that if anybody checks that vehicle with them, that they should tell us, but not tell them.
So, having put a marker for the MG Metro onto HPI, only a couple of days later, they called us to say that someone had gone into a garage in Erith in southeast London to sell the car.
The hire purchase information alert was an important breakthrough, but this meant geographically the investigation had to expand 275 miles down south.
Very quickly, we sent a team down to London to check this out, and the man in the garage did a few second-hand cars. He did repairs and lower end of the market sort of cars, and he remembered the man who had taken in because he'd done a few deals with him before, and he checked it and there was nothing outstanding on HPI at that time. So a deal was done and he part exchanged it for a Ford Escort.
The Erith car dealer provided an accurate description of the man that had sold him the white Metro, but wasn't much more help to the police as the suspect had covered his tracks.
He'd given false particulars, which gave us something to look at, but essentially it looked like a bit of a dead end. We didn't have any more information to go on then.
Unfortunately, and perhaps alarmingly, the car dealer had traded on the MG Metro, but luckily for us, he knew where it was, and we were able to catch up with the vehicle pretty soon thereafter. And so we seized it, we brought it back to Lancashire and had it examined by our scientific officers. They found traces of blood on the driver's door handle, and it would have been reasonable to expect that it was either Mr. Morocco or Mr. Sandham's, but it wasn't. This was the blood of a third person. And we began to speculate that perhaps in the frenzied attack on the two deceased's, maybe, just maybe, the murderer had cut himself, and that this was, in fact, the murderer's blood.
It was looking like a DNA breakthrough. All police needed was a match.
Another important element that came in then was the car that he'd bought from the dealer in Erith, because we had the registration number for that. And then we found, by putting that on the police national computer, we found the car had been stopped in the City of London. Now, what was happening at that time, there was anti-terrorist procedures. Now, the officer who stopped him couldn't actually remember it, but we knew it was near one of the CCTVs that was part of what they call the Ring of Steel around the City of London at the time. Now, when we got that film back, there was the car with a man driving it. Now, the pictures were a bit fuzzy, not good enough to identify, but we noticed that the hand on the steering wheel appeared to be bandaged.
Using the description supplied by the Erith car dealer, the police released a sketch of the suspect to the national press, hoping it might trigger more leads.
After we'd released the artist impression, I got a phone call in the major incident room from a detective from the Kent Constabulary. And he told me quite definitively, "Here, Gov, I think I know who did your murders." And the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This sounded like a breakthrough.
There appeared to be a link with a man who'd been robbing jewellery shops in Kent.
There was some CCTV footage of one of the robberies where the offender was particularly and gratuitously violent towards the shop assistant, punching her in the face when there's absolutely no need to do that. DC Cullen was one of the officers involved in that investigation. He told me that he thought the person responsible for our murders was a man by the name of Terence Derrick Clifton.
Clifton was a suspect in the robberies, and having seen the artist's impression of the man Lancashire police were trying to track down, DC Cullen had thought the resemblance uncanny.
We did some quick checks on the name and the date of birth provided to us by Dick Cullen, and I was delighted to find that Clifton had a conviction in Lancashire, but not just Lancashire, Morecambe. This clearly made a connection between a man who lived in the South East London area and sleepy old Morecambe in Lancashire.
I think when the link was made with the earlier crimes, the robberies of the jewellers, for example, it became apparent that this was an individual who was on the fringes of society, who seemed to see himself as outside the law, somebody who's very much playing by his own rules, maybe with his own sense of purpose.
Armed with their new evidence, the police moved quickly. The hunt was on for Terry Clifton. In their search for a double killer, Lancashire police had identified a prime suspect. All they needed to do now is find him. Intelligence pointed to a man called Terence Clifton for the murders of Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham. But they were yet to track Clifton down and still needed evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime.
Now, one of the important things is on Tony Morocco's body, there was an awful lot of blood. And when they looked at his trousers, they'd taken blood samples from about 6 sites, which is the normal thing to do, and they'd all been the same blood group and they'd all been Tony's blood. However, they went back to it then and looked inside the pocket where his money would have been. And inside the pocket, another blood sample was taken, and that turned out that that wasn't Tony's. So suddenly, here we had the blood sample from the murderer, we thought. So now the case is really building up. We've got this suggested name from the intelligence officer in Kent. We've got a description that would appear to be matched. And now we've got blood from the murderer in the pocket of the deceased. So now we've got to match it.
Clifton had been in prison before, but this was 1995, when personal profile details held on convicts were limited.
Nowadays, it's quite routine for people coming into custody to have a mouth swab taken with a view to having their DNA recorded on the National DNA Database. But that wasn't the case way back then. So what we needed was a sample of Clifton's blood to compare with the blood of the third person from the crime scenes and from the MG Metro.
The investigation was now a nationwide search, and Lancashire police gathered as much support as they could without naming their suspect.
We always enjoyed a pretty good relationship with the police, and on this particular incident, it was outstanding, because partly the police needed us as well to help catch the guy.
We decided to release the artist's impressions to the local paper. And that brought about another development. A young lady came to the police station and she said that based on the artist's impression, she thought that the person that we were looking for was none other than Terence Clifton. She explained that Terence had attended school in the area and, significantly, that he had been in the Morecambe area around the Christmas and New Year period of 1995. The witness went on to say that, that Clifton had arrived in the area in a big old BMW car that he'd driven up from London, but that he had sold it and bought another car locally. And it came as no surprise that that transaction took place at T&M Motors. In fact, the BMW was still lying in the yard at T&M when we went to check.
He'd gone to trade this old car in, and he wasn't happy that Tony had only given him a couple £100 for it or something like that. And then he wanted money because there was petrol in the tank. And Tony took out his big wad of money and peeled off a fiver and said, "Yeah, there's £5 for the petrol." And he very much resented that.
The police now had an additional motive for the murders: revenge.
So the woman who went into Morecambe Police Station to say she'd seen Clifton and knew him was able to tell us that he'd stayed with a family in Morecambe the night before the murders. And when we saw them, they were able to tell us, yes, he'd stayed there the night before.
The people that Clifton had been staying with were also able to say that one day he came out onto the street where his car was parked to find that the tyres had been slashed, and he was extremely annoyed. He turned to his schoolmate, the person he'd been stopping with, and asked to borrow his pedal cycle, saying that he was going to go down to the Whiteland estate where he knew a couple of blokes who were going to sort him out a motor. This, of course, explained why no car was seen at T&M Motors and explained the presence of a pedal cycle propped up against the door at the relevant time. A little while later, Clifton appeared back at the family home. Then he was driving a white hatchback car, and the pedal cycle belonging to the young man with whom he'd been staying was sticking out the back. So he returned the pedal cycle and set off, saying that he was bound back for London.
Police confiscated the bike for forensic testing, where blood was found that matched that on the white Metro and in Tony Morocco's pocket. But they couldn't connect this blood to their suspect.
So we were obviously waiting for a DNA match to see whether or not we could definitively tie that blood to Terence Derek Clifton, but at that stage we didn't have it.
The police could only get the blood test they needed if they were able to arrest Clifton.
We'd already had officers down in London after the initial call, but now we sent more of a team down there to try to find him. And it was becoming very difficult. He certainly didn't make it easy for us. He was changing cars almost daily. And then he was moving from place to place where he was staying, and we always seemed to be a bit behind him.
I get a sense of a continuing theme of him versus the world. Him seeing himself as this character, almost a heroic character who can rise above adversity and demonstrate, in some respects, a superiority. He can give the police the runaround and get away with pretty much what he chooses.
When it was a bit of a manhunt to London, but then you think, Jesus, help they catch him. Everybody was sort of like shocked and look, you know, it was very hard for everybody. I mean, you know, it's all right for me to sit here saying it was hard. Imagine what his family felt like.
At this point, Lancashire Constabulary had officers at a police station in Bexley Heath in Kent, and they also had backup from the Metropolitan Police.
The murder investigation was turning into a manhunt. He was always giving an alias, but there's a common theme to those aliases.
Whilst he was going around giving people false names and addresses to people who didn't know him, there were clues in it for us, because a lot of the names he was given were sort of mix and match of places he'd lived before and people who he had known or relatives. At one of the addresses at which he'd stayed, we found a gold Belcher chain which he'd swapped for some cannabis. And we were able to take that to a jeweller in Lancaster who had repaired it, and he was able to identify it as being the chain he'd repaired for Tony Morocco.
Then the manhunt suddenly turned a corner, when on the 27th of February 1995, 1 month into the investigation, police pursued a lead in Erith in Kent.
Well, the officers went to the 7th floor flat of one of Clifton's ex-girlfriends, because we had reason to suspect he was there. So as they were going through the front door, the officer who was down on the ground saw Clifton backing out of the flat and holding a sawn-off shotgun pointing in towards the flat. So we've now gone up a stage because he's armed and we know he's dangerous. But then he put the gun down and went over the balcony and then dropped down floor by floor. He just let go on each floor and dropped, and then just grabbed the railing of the flat below to slow himself down. And he did that all the way down to the ground, and then he ran off. After that, the press in London called him Spider-Man, and that was it.
I think part of my feelings at the time was I wish he'd fell off that tower block halfway down. You know, the man was a psychopath.
The police recovered the discarded shotgun, but now knew Clifton had access to firearms. He was now a huge danger to the public, and he was on the run.
Then we took the unusual step of publicising his name. Normally you don't publish the names of suspects until somebody's charged. But with this man on the loose and being so dangerous, we had to do that in the hope that people would come forward and tell us where he is, because nobody wants him on the loose in their community, because if he can do this sort of thing, he might do the same to them.
It was unnerving because the sheer brutality of it kept people on edge. They'd never known anything like it before. Somebody capable of doing that was capable of doing anything.
2 grieving families, a community on guard, and an armed killer. It was more urgent than ever. The police were closing in on Terence Clifton, who they believed had killed Tony Morocco and Paul Sandham in cold blood.
The London team had been chasing down the long chain of cars that Clifton had been buying and selling on. And they were hot on the trail of one particular car when they identified it parked up in a street. So the Metropolitan Police firearms team and Lancashire officers kept a watch on the car. And a man came to the car and got in. He was immediately surrounded by the armed officers and was arrested at gunpoint. Unfortunately, it wasn't Clifton. It was, however, a man who'd bought the car from Clifton only a number of hours previously. And once he'd been dusted down, he was able to tell us that, and to tell us the car that Clifton had bought off him. We were now only hours behind our suspect.
Clifton was reported to be driving an Austin Montego.
Now, in possession of information that he was in the Montego motor car, there were a number of officers plotted up in the area, and then 2 officers saw him get into the car, and then he went round and parked up in Finstead Road. It was called in, and the armed team then went in, and he was arrested. He surrendered straight away.
Finally, they'd got Clifton. Arrested at gunpoint on the 6th of March 1995, 6 weeks after the murders.
We had him now. And so it's a great relief that this man's no longer on the streets. He's a very dangerous man, and he's now locked up. So that was a huge relief. But then, you see, the job from my end of things particularly is really just starting, because now you've got to put all that evidence together to turn it into a case of admissible evidence.
When news of the arrest came through, it came as a relief to us, and I think also to our readers and obviously the families, that we were able to print the fact that finally this person the police had been looking for so long and who had been involved in so many escape dramas had finally been arrested, and that we were getting somewhere.
Police needed to prove that blood found on the stolen white Metro, the pushbike connected to the crime, and in Tony Morocco's pocket, belonged to Clifton. They took DNA swabs from him and awaited the results.
Yes, having been arrested down in London, then obviously he had to be brought up to Lancaster, where he was held. And we questioned him, and he thought he could be cleverer than us, if you like, because he was told briefly what the evidence was. And he said he happened to be walking through the White Lund Industrial Estate, like you do, and he'd seen this car parked at the roadside, the white Metro, with the keys in it and all the documents lying on the seat. And he just intended to steal the car. And that was his defence.
He was rational, he was polite, he admitted the theft of the MG Metro, but claimed that he had nothing to do whatsoever with the murders. So, following the interviews, we decided that we were going to charge him, notwithstanding the fact that we didn't have the DNA evidence at that stage. We did feel that we had sufficient evidence to charge, and we did.
Clifton was remanded in custody while he awaited trial, and several weeks later the results of his DNA swab came through, which, as police suspected, was a match with DNA evidence from the double murder.
We had this man with a history of extreme violence. We had a man who knew the area, despite the fact he had a London address. He'd been to school in Morecambe. He was known to be in the area. He'd borrowed a bicycle to go to the garage and had come back later with the white Metro, with the bicycle in it, with blood on it, which was his blood. Then we had his blood in Tony Morocco's pocket at the scene. We then had footprints at the scene of that murder and at the scene of Paul Sandham's murder. We could link the two scenes again because of the earth from the field and the earth in the driver's footwell of the Toyota that Clifton had then driven back to the garage. We've got the Belcher chain that was found in London that he'd swapped for some cannabis, which we could then identify positively as being Tony Morocco's. So we got an awful lot of evidence to make a case for the prosecution.
So in the next few months, Clifton made a number of appearances both at the Crown Court and at the Magistrates' Court as part of the process leading towards his eventual trial. His behaviour had deteriorated from that at the time of his interview. He assaulted a prison officer on one occasion and blew raspberries at the judge on another occasion.
On Saturday, the 24th of June 1995, Clifton was due to be formally committed for trial at Lancashire Magistrates' Court.
And then we came to the worst of all, his behaviour. He said he wanted private consultation with his solicitor, which he is entitled. So was taken into a room with his solicitor. Then he produced a sharpened telescopic car aerial, which he'd secreted within his rectum before he left prison, and then held this against his solicitor's throat and threatened him and took him hostage.
We called in a hostage negotiator, and we also called in officers who were trained to put an end to a siege like this by more forceful means.
I remember getting a call from a colleague at quite an early hour of the morning to say that there was an incident in progress at Lancaster Magistrates' Court. At that time, I worked for the prison service, and I was on call for hostage negotiation situations.
Dr. Need made his way to the court, while Lancashire police tried to manage the situation as best they could.
As part of this siege, he called for an imam to come and speak to him, claiming that he was a convert to Islam, and the imam duly came and spoke to him and declared that, in his opinion, he wasn't a convert.
When I arrived, everybody was rather tired, but above all, I think, attention focused on the well-being of the hostage.
The siege itself, from the time we took him, lasted for some 21 hours. So it's gone on a long time. And of course, when you're dealing with somebody like that, who's not that well balanced and clearly dangerous, as time goes on, they're getting tired, and either they give up or they can get worse and worse. At the end, things were getting worse, and that's why there had to be a rapid intervention.
It was decided that we should explore the possibility of tactical intervention, and that really centred upon separating Clifton from the hostage. And that was achieved by offering Clifton a cup of coffee, which he accepted and took a few steps over to reach for it. And at that point, the door to the room burst open and several gentlemen jumped on him. So it was brought to a peaceful resolution.
It was erratic behaviour, and it may have been just part of the delaying tactics. I'm not sure what he felt that he had to gain by taking his solicitor hostage. It seemed to me to be the last turn of the card of an increasingly desperate man.
Clifton's troublemaking continued. He sacked his defence lawyer and told police he would represent himself. The trial at Preston Crown Court didn't happen for 2 years.
So eventually he came up for trial in January of 1997. And then when it came to the day of trial, he refused to come out of the cell and face his own trial.
Because Clifton was unrepresented, it meant that the witnesses were not cross-examined, although the judge maintained the impartiality of the trial by asking pertinent questions of the witnesses himself. But nonetheless, the pace of the trial was much quicker than you would normally expect, and I recall that on one occasion, in excess of 30 witnesses in one day were heard.
At the trial, the injuries sustained by Tony Morocco were so bad, it took the pathologist like 45 minutes just to describe the injuries, and the family sat through all that.
The jury didn't take a long time at all to convict him of the murders. In a matter of 40 minutes or so, they'd returned unanimous verdicts of guilty to 2 offences of murder and 1 of the theft of the white MG car.
All that was left was to sentence Clifton for his horrific crimes.
The judge insisted, quite rightly, he'd be brought up for sentencing, and he wasn't for going quietly. And it took 9 prison officers a long time, having to have him wrap him in sheets to stop him kicking and punching and biting the officers, and they carried him up to the dock where he heard the sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment twice over for each of the murders and 4 years for stealing the car. The family who'd sat throughout the trial listened to the dreadful things that happened to their relatives, and I think they were very relieved at the outcome of the trial and the fact that he was going away, hopefully forever.
It was the most shocking and demanding investigation Lancashire police had ever seen. But finally, it had come to an end.
The chain of events, working backwards from the siege to the escape from the balcony, the fact that it was a double murder, the fact that it was a manhunt, I just don't think that anybody could have written a credible script that could have fitted our scenario.
We knew we weren't far away, and we knew if we kept going, then eventually we'd get him, and we did.
After 3 months playing cat and mouse with the police, a sensational escape and a hostage situation, Terry Clifton would be an old man if and when he was ever released. And finally, the town of Morecambe could start trying to get back to normal.
With 5-star reviews across the board and immense performances from Jodie Foster and Kaylee Reese, True Detective Night Country is available now on Sky Atlantic.
When the test destroys marital relationships. It had been a few months since I'd last seen my ex-girlfriend, but lo and behold, there she was, sitting in the Starbucks closest to my flat, looking visibly pregnant. She was there with Lou, my college classmate, who wasn't really among my friends. They didn't see me. I considered sneaking out, but I stopped myself. I had to be an adult about this situation. So I watched through the window. Randy was just radiant. I knew she'd be a great mother. Except for the rounded bulge from the baby, she hadn't put on much weight. Her blonde ponytail stuck out from under her baseball cap. It was early Saturday morning. She probably hadn't showered yet. From the conversation between them, it looked like Randy was about to leave, while a relaxed Lou looked like he wanted to stay at the cafe a little longer. Yeah, well, my ex was never much of a coffee drinker. Apparently, she wasn't too keen on trying stale scones or dry croissants either. I positioned myself to walk through the door she wasn't going to use. When she left, I did just that. Randy and I were on the verge of getting married before things fell apart. I met her in college, then we dated seriously and exclusively during our junior and senior years, moved in together after graduation, and began planning a life together as we took our first steps into the professional world. I thought our journey together would last forever. Then suddenly, one day, it all came crashing down. When I walked in, Lou was staring at the Starbucks branded mugs with the obviously inflated price tag and the packages of ground coffee, ethically grown but sold at unethical prices. "Hey, Lou! Good to see you! How's it going?" Lou looked at me with a slightly hazy look. My former classmate was clearly caffeine deficient. Oh, hey, man! Good to see you. Coffee?" I asked. "My treat." "Sure," he replied, smiling. I got a simple, small, drip-roasted coffee with 1 chemical sweetener. He ordered a totally ultra-fruity, mega-sweet, nano-complicated double super-duper macchiato, or something like that. When we sat down, I asked, "Did that happen to be Randy I just saw with you?" "Yeah. I think she's pregnant?" I casually asked her a question. "Yeah. Is it yours?" "Of course it is. You know, one of my pucks got past the goalie," he announced with a proud smile. "Congratulations." I raised my mug in greeting. "We started dating after you guys broke up," he explained. "We got married a month ago." "When is she due?" I asked. In about 4 months." I did the math and smiled. I remembered our conversation with Randy very well because it was a triple combination of blows to the male psyche. "We need to talk." "Honey, do you love me?" "I'm pregnant." I remember being surprised and confused. We had always been cautious. Then from the seed of doubt quickly grew a tree of suspicion. All right, darling. I'll do what I have to do. Absolutely. We need to do a paternity test. Randy immediately broke our embrace and stared into my eyes, frowning. Her eyes were somehow not happy. There's nothing without trust, she said angrily. Trust but verify, I responded with the wisdom of the ancients. Getting an intrauterine DNA test was my red line, before I would pay for anything, and certainly before I would marry her. So all of a sudden the expected marriage took, and fell apart as it turned out because of my lack of trust. Dear Randy never wanted a DNA test for some reason. So here I am, sitting in Starbucks, across from Randy's supposed baby daddy. We both got a bun. I paid for a couple. When we were done, Lou tried to give me money, but I refused. Congratulations again, Lou. I don't need your money today. You see, Randy and I never broke up until she told me she was pregnant. I wanted to do a DNA test, but she refused. Now, either you're going to spend your life raising my bastard, or I dodged a bullet by spending my life raising yours. The least I can do for you, Lou, is buy you a coffee and a stale bun. It's a lot cheaper. Besides, even though she tried to get me to marry her first, she probably likes you better. After all, she did cheat on me with you. So maybe lust will eventually turn to love. Who knows, mate? Who knows? Lou looked shocked as I stood up with those last words, patted him sympathetically on the back, and walked out the door. That was the last time I saw either of the two of them. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. After a while, I left town and settled a few states away. No, I wasn't running from anyone. There was just nothing else keeping me there. A few years later, I heard that Lou and Randy had divorced. Apparently, he too had trust issues I was familiar with that he never got over. The Department of Social Services never contacted me about child support. It must not have been my child after all.